Hello everyone, I know you are watching this video to accompany your sleep. So, if you like this video, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. Also don't forget to tell me where you are from, and what time you watched this video. And let's begin. Door of the bedroom, the massive glass panel sliding shut on her left. The retreating figure of the pool boy, outlined in his bright white polo shirt, faded into the encroaching darkness of the early evening. Her gaze fell on the towering 14-foot high glass walls that served as her only barrier to the cool, enveloping woodland. The untamed nature seemed to creep closer, its sharp edges softened by the villa's well-manicured backyard. With a sigh of resignation, she buttoned up her crisp white Loro Piana blouse, her eyes captivated by the mesmerizing dance of blue light shimmering across the serene surface of the lap pool. Her fingers absent-mindedly brushed the golden strands of her hair from her eyes, parting her silky locks on either side of her face. Cassandra Foam held the wine glass. It's cold. Embrace was long gone, replaced with room temperature indifference. It had been filled earlier in the evening, prior to her clandestine rendezvous with Julian, the pool boy. The bubbly Prosecco pounded her palate, carrying along with it a bitter twinge of guilt. Her affairs with Julian had grown from sporadic indiscretions into a weekly ritual, a transgression not so much against her husband of 22 years, but against herself. Swirling the pale liquid in her glass, she sought refuge in a fond memory, a radiant afternoon on the banks of Lake Como, where she and Philip were pronounced wife and husband. The nostalgic moment quickly soured, chased away by the biting wine, reminding her of the stagnant bitterness that had seeped into her marital life. It hadn't always been this way. When they were busy raising their son, Philip had struck a perfect balance, giving time to her, their child, and his budding career as an investment banker. Lucas was now a 19-year-old, making his mark playing lacrosse at the University of Southern California. The corners of her lips curled into a sad smile. Pride for the man Lucas had become mingling with the loneliness that held her in its icy grip. Lucas, born on a cool September night in 2004 at Stanford Hospital, was a lifeline in her isolated existence. He reached out to her every Sunday, their conversations an endearing exchange of updates, laughter, and tender advice. His last interaction with Philip, however, had been a curt beration over an overdrawn credit card, a stark contrast to the loving father-son bond they once shared. A tender memory surfaced, painting a vivid image of Lucas's first lacrosse game, back when Philip was still making an effort to genuinely engage with their son. Watching Lucas dart across the field, his athletic frame casting long, fleet-footed shadows as the opposing team hot on his heels, she felt a surge of pride. His well-aimed hurl of the ball to his teammate was like a lighthouse beam cutting through the gloom of her thoughts, warming her. She reminisced about the house party Lucas had thrown during the start of his senior year's winter break, while she was away with her friends in the snowy seclusion of Aspen. A part of her knew she should have been angered by his actions, yet at his age, she saw the reflection of her own youthful rebelliousness. Philip's increasingly extended absences gnawed at her like an ever-hungry beast in the depths of her solitude. First, it was long hours at work, then a pattern of coming home every other night, and finally, a pitiful appearance on Thursdays. His rushed trips back from Seattle on those days were mere smoke and mirrors, a feeble attempt to prop up the crumbling edifice of their marriage. His lack of presence at her mother's funeral, replaced by a disinterested Skype call, only amplified the echoing hollowness within her. The announcement of his election as vice chairman of the major investment bank he had given his life to only seem to hammer another nail in the coffin of their fading relationship. The doorbell's melancholic chime roused Cassandra from her deep musings. Draping a soft cashmere sweater from the sprawling bed over her shoulders, she ran her fingers through her golden hair, her bare feet padding gently across the glossy Portofino marble floor leading to the foyer. A quick glimpse through the tall window that guarded the grand entrance revealed the retreating figure of an Amazon delivery driver, disappearing into the running truck. A quick thank you echoed down the driveway, chasing his vanishing form. She unlocked the door and collected the package, its label bearing Philip's name. An undertow of resentment guided her hand, placing it a bit more forcefully than necessary onto the colossal black marble kitchen island. She reached up to the warm hickory wood cupboard hidden behind meticulously organized jars of spices. Behind the innocuous paprika, a clandestine sanctuary housed her secret escape. The small bag, a token of a private chartered flight from San Francisco to San Martin, was procured legally. The insidious street dealers, like shadowy figures in puffy coats, skulking in the parking lots of malls and 7-Elevens, didn't deserve her trust. She wouldn't fall victim to fentanyl poisoning, a chilling tale she heard too often. The cocaine, her new companion, served as a temporary refuge, a short-lived bliss drowning out the agonizing reality of Philip's infidelity. Cassandra meticulously tapped a thin trail of the granular white substance onto the polished surface of her West Elm concrete table. With the back of her credit card, she expertly brushed it into a fine line. Her gaze strayed to the sweeping wall of floor-to-ceiling windows, before snapping back to the white strip that lay before her. Hunching over, she inhaled sharply, feeling the gritty powder rush up her nostrils and scrape its way down her nasal passage. A jolt of discomfort seized her, a sensation akin to inhaling flour or perhaps fine sand. The abrasive substance scraped against her sensitive nasal lining, leaving a harsh reminder of its passage. She quickly wiped away the vestiges clinging to the edge of her nostril. A wave of exhilaration swept over her, followed swiftly by a rising tide of paranoia. Her heart pounded in her chest like a wild drum, each beat echoing the growing fear that gnawed at her sanity. She felt observed, pursued, a breath at the nape of her neck prickling her senses. Wide-eyed and on edge, tears pooled, brimming over her lower lids as she battled to clear the unbearable dryness that assailed her eyes. With a swift, practiced motion, she swept the leftover powder onto the woven rug beneath the table. "Barbara will clean tomorrow," she muttered to herself, startled by the intrusion of her voice upon the palpable silence. Her hand reached out to draw the massive white curtain shut, her heart pounding as if it were a wild rabbit caught in the glare of a predator. The distant tree line seemed to harbor watchful eyes, feeding her paranoia. Suddenly spinning around, Cassandra's heart pounded in her chest, her eyes darting around the room for an unseen phantom, but all she found was her own reflection echoing back at her from the glossy surfaces of the expansive living space. A nervous giggle escaped her lips, her drug-induced paranoia appearing ludicrous now. She redirected her attention to the corner of the room, where a sleek marble sculpture stood in stark contrast to the unexpected company she now found herself in. The modern piece was the result of a Swiss designer's skill, someone she'd briefly known in a life that seemed a world away now. And there, incongruously at ease in her plush designer armchair, was a man she had never seen before. The atmosphere was electrified with suspense, every tick of the clock amplifying her rising panic. Before she fully registered her own actions, a scream ripped through the silence, escaping from Cassandra. The man, without missing a beat, vaulted from his chair. His speed was unnerving, a blurred figure traversing the length of the living room before diving through the colossal window. A symphony of shattering safety glass rang out, a cascade of shards glistening as they rained down onto the polished floor. Cassandra's eyes remained fixated on the retreating figure, a silhouette of inky darkness cast stark against her perfectly manicured terrace. The intruder moved with such surreal agility that the details of his naked form blurred and twisted, becoming an enigmatic cipher before disappearing entirely. As he crossed the sprawling emerald lawn, he melted seamlessly into the hedgerow's natural barrier, separating her domain from the wild, untamed underbrush. And then, just like that, he vanished, swallowed whole by the Stygian shadows of the dense forest beyond. "Better run because I'm calling the cops," she screeched into the night. Her words, jagged shards of fear, shot through the shattered window frame. Her voice clashed against the orchestra of rustling foliage and the thunderous pounding of her heart that threatened to explode from her chest. The surreal, grotesque reality of the situation felt like a maelstrom threatening to tear her sanity asunder. How had an intruder penetrated her fortress without her knowledge? Who was he? Or worse, what was it? Such harrowing questions gnawed at her mind, casting monstrous shadows of paranoia that lurched and writhed in the dark recesses of her psyche. "I must be dreaming," she attempted to reassure herself with a hollow chuckle, her laugh a haunting rasp, brittle as autumn leaves crushed underfoot. "No, Cassandra," she croaked to her reflection, a specter of fear mirrored in the television screen. "You're just dreaming." Her voice teetered on the precipice of hysteria, a whisper caught in the eye of the storm. Whipping her head around, she scrutinized the expansive living room. Each shadow grew darker, pooling into ominous ink blots under the pallid glare of a crappy reality show, endlessly replaying on the flat-screen TV. The spectral light from the television birthed monstrous shadows, their sinewy tendrils elongating across the room, reaching out like skeletal fingers. They threatened to seize her ankle, to yank her down into an unfathomable abyss of insanity, a pit from which there was no escape. She drew a deep breath, eyelids sinking shut as her psychologist had taught her, focusing on a calming, grounding memory. Yes, Lucas, she thought, his memory a gentle beacon in the churning sea of her thoughts. But her solitary lifeline was severed abruptly as the low hum of the garage doors permeated her makeshift sanctuary, causing her eyes to flick open. Unblinking, she stared down the long corridor leading to the garage and pantry spaces, the hum echoing like a warning call in the pit of her stomach. Her footsteps clacked against the marble. The wood-paneled walls seemed to grow eyes, their forested eyes tracking her in every reflection, reaching out of the graining of the wood towards her, trying to break free. The dull accent lighting was classy, but it only succeeded in blinding her, drawing her eyes back and forth so much. Something moved to her left, then above her. The marble patterns writhed underfoot, holding back an unseen serpent as if it were a frozen lake. She stared wide-eyed, her eyes burning from the lack of blinking. The being reached out towards her, the veins in the marble forming a face. Its eyes were pure white in the marble, staring through her head as it smiled an empty smile. "Philip!" she howled, her voice echoing off the sterile walls as she yanked open the robust door leading into the garage. But what greeted her was not the comforting form of her husband, nor the routine sight of their cars parked neatly in line. Instead, it was an all-consuming void, an abyss that devoured every shred of hope and left in its place a gnawing dread. The cavernous four-car garage was transformed into an underworld of shadows. Any semblance of familiarity was eradicated, replaced by a realm of darkness that seemed to pulsate with a life of its own. Suddenly, the motion sensor detected her presence, and the 2 rows of antiquated fluorescent rods flickered into existence, their light a dim spectral blue that was more haunting than reassuring. The illumination, stark and harsh, painted a grim picture of her surroundings. The hulking form of her SUV and the 2 sedans sat like dormant monsters, their sleek bodies reflecting the eerie light in an otherworldly sheen. The vehicles cast chilling shadows that stretched out across the concrete floor, obscuring the details in a thick blanket of blackness. Her attention snagged on a silhouette nestled in the far corner of the garage, partially hidden by the mammoth storage rack adjacent to the bay doors. The form was strangely humanoid, a grotesquely elongated shadow perched in the corner as if it were a grim sentinel. A single smoky tendril of darkness unfurled from the figure, undulating across the surface of the garage door with an almost sentient deliberation. This dark specter loomed like a demonic starfish, becoming less a part of the garage and more a haunting testament to Cassandra's escalating paranoia. It seemed to whisper without sound, its very existence an ominous melody that gripped Cassandra's sanity with icy fingers. The twin bulbs blinked out of existence suddenly, their absence marking the birth of an all-consuming darkness. It surged forward, a palpable wave of terror that caught her in its icy grip. Her feet drummed against the marble in a futile attempt to escape its clutches, only to be thrust back into the sparsely lit, oppressive confines of the hallway. "No," she stammered, the beast in the marble swimming towards her, the veining in the rock distorting and bending as it passed. "No," she screamed, her voice piercing the oppressive silence as she pushed herself off the wall. The knots in the wooden panels jerked ominously towards her, their animated forms reaching out to ensnare her, pulling her into their maddening chaos. Her heart hammered against her ribs, threatening to burst as bitter tears streamed down her cheeks. Her mascara bled, streaking her deathly pale face and staining the collar of her linen blouse. Suddenly, she felt an invisible force impeding her retreat, tugging her towards the gaping maw of the open garage door. "Stop it!" she shrieked, her voice cracking under the sheer terror squeezing her vocal cords. Then, as abruptly as it had seized her, the unseen force relinquished its grip, hurling her across the polished floor. In an instant, she was back on her feet, lunging into a sharp left turn at the corridor and breaking into a desperate sprint. She raced through the expanse of the eerily quiet living room and darted past the ominous silence of the kitchen. The familiar surroundings morphed into a nightmarish labyrinth, her escalating fear lending them an aura of surreal dread. The hallway seemed to elongate before her, an insidious illusion making it stretch an additional 2 feet for every foot she covered. The cacophony of thumps and scratches filled the air, feeding her fear. Something or someone hammered at a door next to her, the solid wood appearing to churn like dough in a mixer, its surface undulating as though hands and limbs were pressing from within, desperate to break free. The sight cast wicked demonic shadows that danced and twisted across the hallway, the manifestations of her spiraling paranoia. She rounded a corner and threw herself against the door to the powder room bathroom. It instantly gave in, opening and crashing against the vertical wood walls. The door slammed and she forced herself into the corner of the small room, curling into a fetal position, wrapping her arms around her knees as she rocked back and forth. Her heart thumped, slowly turning her head to look at the face writhing in the wood grain next to her. "Philip!" Her scream echoed in the confined space as she hurled herself towards the granite countertop, snatching a pair of hair-trimming scissors. The cold metal bit into her palm as she watched the horrifying apparition take shape in the wall, a grotesque parade of faces rippling across the surface before lunging towards her. The door slammed inwards, holding as something tried to get in. Tears flooded her eyes as she thrashed the scissors into the wood over and over. Splinters flew from the gaping wound in the panels as she stabbed the apparition in the grain. The face was pulled back into the surface. "Leave me alone," she bellowed, her eyes clenching shut as she continued her mad butchery of the wood. "Get out of my head," she muttered to herself, the low murmur suddenly erupting into a high-pitched shriek. With a burst of manic energy, she dragged the scissors across the entire length of the wall, shearing the surface off. Splinters flew about, savagely scratching her hands and wrists. Faces trapped within the wood wailed in silent agony, their mouths contorting grotesquely. Her manic frenzy halted as she kicked her feet against the toilet, pushing herself against the door, surveying her work. Cassandra's nervous giggles punctured the oppressive silence. "Yes, yes, yes," she babbled, her voice edging towards hysteria. "Stay away." Her shriek echoed against the claustrophobic walls, the terror-strewn syllables bouncing back and forth in the small space. She watched in abject horror as the gashes she had made on the wooden door, filled with a viscous black substance, the dark tendrils inching menacingly towards her. Desperately, she tried to handle the door, staring into the wooden eyes of her husband, as she viciously pounded against the surface, sobbing and convulsing as it held firm. Her futile attempts to escape left red streaks on the paneling, the residue of her once immaculately manicured hands. The encroaching darkness closed in around her, the dim light from the bulbs flickering erratically, as if they were engaged in some twisted ritualistic chant. The ominous strobes of light revealed the final shreds of her sanity unraveling, their departure marked by her ear-piercing scream. An unseen force seized her throat, its ghostly fingers tracing her features and strangling the breath out of her. Cassandra crumpled to the floor, the teal porcelain tiles cold and unyielding against her trembling form. She was a pathetic heap of terror, her mouth agape in a silent scream as the sinister shadows invaded her body, slithering down her throat and clawing at her heart. An icy chill filled her chest, freezing her from within as her desperate lungs begged for air. Panic took hold, her frantic eyes scanning the cold teal porcelain tiles beneath her, as if hoping they would reveal an escape. The scissors clattered out of her weakening grip, their sharp echo blending with the thrumming silence. The last vestiges of life slipped from her lips, choked back by the relentless darkness. As death's cold fingers tightened their grip around her throat, her world dissolved into an eternal suffocating blackness. Barbara stood on the threshold of the powder room, her hands at her sides, regarding her friend and employer of over a decade. Even in death, Cassandra retained an eerie elegance, her blouse stained with the crimson of her own blood, draped around her contorted and static form. She lay in a loose fetal position on the chilling tile floor, a thin trail of white powder clinging to her upper lip. Her eyes were closed, yet Barbara felt their vacant stare bore into her. "Ma'am, please step aside," an officer intruded, pushing a stretcher and brandishing an oxygen mask, his bright orange vest contrasting starkly with the somber scene. "Of course," Barbara responded, weakly stepping aside as the stretcher brushed past her. She watched as Cassandra's lifeless body was loaded onto the gurney, strapped down, and fitted with an oxygen mask. The strobing red and blue lights of the ambulance washed over the scene as Cassandra was wheeled away. Barbara knew they couldn't save her. The potent cocktail of endorphins and ground-up fentanyl would ensure that. She observed the traces of Cassandra's final struggle during her overdose. Deep gashes marred the wooden paneling of the walls and door. Red fingerprints smeared the door and mirror. Barbara's gaze fell upon a pair of scissors, which she promptly nudged under the bathroom vanity with her foot. The shattered window in the living room perplexed Barbara. The tempered glass was too thick for her feeble arms to break, and the alarm had not been triggered. Her confusion lingered. The room hummed as the Roomba vacuumed up traces of cocaine from under the coffee table and the carpet. She snatched the bag of powder from the spice drawer, adding it to the contents of the vacuum cleaner. A grim smile pulled at the corners of Barbara's mouth for the first time in months. Tonight, she would see Philip without his wife for the first time. Emptying the Roomba vacuum's contents into the pool, she watched the dull particulates meld seamlessly with the chlorinated water. Her gaze swept across the well-manicured lawn bordered by hydrangeas awash in the auburn glow of the rising sun. The air was crisp, yet a vague sense of being watched lingered on the fringes of her awareness, unnerving her. She knew Cassandra's security cameras were mere props designed to deter potential intruders, yet she felt as though she was being scrutinized, akin to the judgmental stare of teenagers at a shopping mall or the disapproving glare of an old Italian woman. Nonetheless, she shrugged off the feeling and sauntered back into the house to await her lover. A loud honk sounded as the car in front of me came to a sudden stop. Something had dashed across the road, something large. I slammed my foot down on the brakes and prayed the icy road wouldn't allow yet another fender bender. It was hard to make out any shapes through the thick veil of the blizzard's harrowing symphony, but I could tell that whatever had crossed the highway had done so with speed and precision. Maybe a moose, I thought to myself, paying no further mind to the matter. I reclined into my seat and turned up the volume on the radio. Frank Sinatra's "I've Got You Under My Skin" filled the cozy insides of my SUV, and I felt my heart rate steadily stabilize. It had been several hours since I left my hometown, and now I was surrounded by an endless expanse of white as far as the eye could see. There should have been a forest on either side of the highway, but with the severely deteriorating weather conditions, it was impossible to make out anything farther than 6 feet away. As I tapped my fingers on the steering wheel in perfect synchronization with the song, I grew more and more impatient. We had stood still for at least 5 minutes now. Surely there couldn't be this much traffic all the way out here. The song was nearly over, and we still hadn't moved. Behind me, I could hear a chorus of aggressive honking. There were at least 6 cars behind me, and as far as I could tell, probably 6 in front as well. Their headlights were the only indicator of their existence, as the snow had turned everything else invisible. Then a grisly thought spread like wildfire throughout the crevices of my mind. Had there been an accident? I sat up in my seat and made an attempt to somehow peek above the top of the car ahead of me. It was futile. "What is going on?" I murmured under my breath as a loud sigh escaped my body. The howling winds outside violently slammed into the exterior of the car, eliminating any notions that I may have had about stepping out and investigating. For now, it was best I just waited it out. It would surely pass in a minute or so. I picked up my phone and started messing around with a few apps. I do not condone texting and driving, but considering we hadn't been moving for a while, I'd wager a short social media session couldn't hurt anyone. And besides, it didn't look like I was going anywhere anytime soon either. I even glanced over to the half-empty bottle of Jack Daniels that laid unassuming on the floorboard of the seat beside me, but I decided against it for now. Prior to this traffic jam, I had been visiting my extended family for the holidays back in my hometown. Due to reasons we don't need to delve into, I was forced to leave earlier than I'd initially expected, which was fine by me as I couldn't stand another second of chatty family drama and that awful holiday cheer. Forgive me if I'm sparse with the details, but for privacy's sake, I won't disclose the name of the town I departed from, nor where I am currently headed. All you need to know is that the road I was traveling on was located pretty far up in the northwestern region of the United States, and it was absolutely freezing. Some time passed, and the vehicles on the road hadn't moved an inch. It was as though they were rooted to the icy foundations below. Dauntingly, I observed as the car in front of me was in the process of getting devoured by the rapidly growing snowfall. Its tires were nearly completely engulfed, and I figured that it wouldn't be long until getting home in time to watch today's football game would be the least of my concerns. Then, growing in the distance, were sirens. I looked up from my phone and directed my gaze toward the side view mirror and saw a faint blinking blue light penetrate through the thicket of snow. The ambulance zoomed past me at breakneck speeds, and shortly after, a police car followed. This only reaffirmed my belief that something terribly wrong had occurred. I scrolled through my phone and continued as usual, though my digital endeavors would prove to be quite fruitless. The longer I used my phone, the worse the connection seemed to get. TikTok and YouTube videos began buffering, and other apps that required internet connectivity wouldn't even load. I'm by no means a physicist, tech guru, meteorologist, or whatever the appropriate title for this would be, but I surmised that the ongoing raging storm could be linked to the shortcomings of my phone's signal. Incidentally, I was also in the middle of nowhere, 40 minutes away from the nearest settlement, and 3 hours away from the closest city. The remoteness of my location would surely also have an impact on my... A light tapping on the window caught me off guard, and I jolted in my seat. Crap, I thought, as the sight of a bulky police officer greeted me on the other side of the glass. By the looks of it, he had been out in the storm for way too long. His cheeks were glowing pink, and he had snowflakes stuck in his burly mustache. I quickly stowed my phone in my pocket and rolled down the window, preparing to explain why I was on my phone in traffic. But the officer didn't care about any of that. "Good evening, sir," the officer started. "There has been an incident further up the road. Right now, we're trying to... Could you turn that down?" He gestured toward the radio. Sorry, officer, of course," I replied, dialing the scroll wheel of the volume button all the way down. "As I was saying, we're trying to evacuate this whole area. Once I've gotten to the final car at the end behind you there, and I've gotten him to start backing up, I want you to follow him immediately. You want me to drive in reverse?" I questioned, a quizzical grimace stretched across my face. "Road's too narrow. Right now, I don't see any other option, unless you want to try turning around and risk ending up in one of these ditches here," the officer said with a slight smirk. But before I had the chance to say anything else, a thundering bang sounded a couple of yards in front of us. The winds carried the sound with ear-splitting accuracy. The officer reacted immediately, hovering his hand above the pistol in his holster. He took a few steps back and tried signaling in on his shoulder-mounted radio. Another bang echoed through the harsh wind, followed by another, then another. The sounds were unmistakable. They were gunshots. He drew his pistol and rushed toward the source of the sounds. I watched as he slowly faded from view. A void of white had swallowed him whole. I stared in shock for a couple of minutes, expecting the officer to return any moment. But he never came. A small mass of snow had started accumulating inside my car, so I quickly rolled up the window. I could hear another set of muffled gunshots joining the already dominant ones. It sounded like they were completely emptying their magazines into whoever or whatever. Then, in perfect unity, the sound stopped. The silence weighed heavy as I sat in anticipation. My mind was flustered with thoughts and ideas, but the prevalent feeling that occupied my body was a creeping sensation of dread. Just what the hell was going on? I anxiously tapped my fingers on the steering wheel. In a moment of weakness, I once again looked over to the bottle on the floor. I hadn't gone this long without a drink in years. One sip wouldn't hurt, right? Just to calm my nerves. If I was discreet enough, the officers would have no way of knowing. Just as I leaned over to the passenger side to pick the bottle up, my vehicle violently trembled. Something powerful had slammed into my car. I cursed loudly and rose back up, abandoning the bottle. I frantically searched around, looking for any signs of the perpetrator. I scanned my rear view, the side window, and even the passenger side's window. Nothing but a flurry of white specks. Then I noticed something in the blizzard in front of me. A black silhouette grew larger and larger, and soon I could make out what it was. A man. No, two men. And they were running towards my car. But these guys weren't police officers, nor any of the paramedics that had arrived earlier. They must have been the denizens of the cars in front. And then 2 more people appeared behind them, either giving chase to or following the 2 men in front. As they inched closer, I could properly see the expressions carved into their faces. They were terrified. They looked as though they had seen a ghost. The first 2 men ran past my car. They didn't even look at me. Shortly after, the 2 people behind them followed, a woman and a boy. They hurried across the ice at great speeds while at the same time exercising caution, so as to not slip and fall. Before I had the chance to react, they were gone, having once again been consumed by the endless white void. This was definitely cause for concern. Who in their right mind would abandon the comforts of their vehicles all the way out here, in this weather? The driver in front of me cautiously opened one of the doors of the car. A middle-aged white man with a beer gut stepped out into the cold. He slung his puffer jacket around his shoulders and stared off into the distance ahead. I watched him curiously, wondering if he too would start running, and then wondering whether I should join him if he indeed decided to. Right now it seemed illogical, but then again, these guys clearly knew something I didn't. Maybe there was a gas leak ahead? Maybe some radioactive material had been improperly disposed of? My mind raced, looking for any logical explanations for my current predicament, but I found none. The man took a few steps forward, intently inspecting the blizzard ahead. It seemed as though something had caught his attention. He took another few steps forward, positioning himself in front of his car, partially obscuring my view of him, his left side still visible. But there was something else. In the deep recesses of the snowstorm, something was moving. I strained my eyes, leaning forward in my seat and staring through my snow-covered windshield. Approaching from the left side of the road onto the oncoming lane, a large silhouette bobbed up and down as it slowly advanced toward the man. Though it was far away, it looked to be near twice his height, but he hadn't noticed it. The man was far too busy examining whatever had caught his attention directly in front of him. An overwhelming sense of dread filled my veins. The way the silhouette moved, I couldn't quite explain why, but it felt predatory, like a lion stalking its prey through the thick underbrush of the African savanna, right before springing into action and securing itself a fresh meal. Was it a moose? It didn't look to be. The proportions were way off, and it almost looked to be bipedal, but I couldn't think of any other large animals out here that the silhouette could have belonged to. I doubted this area had ever seen any polar bears, and even so, they couldn't possibly reach this size, could they? It was like my primal instincts screamed at me to do something. I felt my fight or flight start to kick in, but I managed to keep it under wraps. I was safe inside my warm SUV, but the man, however, I had to warn him somehow. If I honked my horn, whatever was stalking him might have leaped into action right away. It was too risky. Before I could think of anything, the man screamed in terror. Muffled through my car's thick exterior, his cries echoed. I focused ahead of me, trying to get a glimpse of what had riled him up so badly. He turned around in an attempt to flee. He had almost made it back to the driver's side door of his car when he planted his face into the cold, hard ground. He must have slipped. The predatory silhouette to his left was nowhere to be seen now. For a brief moment, I locked eyes with the man. A familiar look of excruciating fear contoured across his face. He dug his long and unkempt nails into the snow, slowly crawling forwards, and then he screamed yet again, but this time, not out of fear but in pain. Violently, he was dragged back. I watched in horror as the man tried to fight it, clutching the powdery snow as if it would actually provide a stable grip. He was dragged in front of his car and out of my view. Just before he rounded the left side corner, I could see his red-covered hands desperately cling to the tire, and then he was pulled away. I was in complete disbelief. It was like a scene from a horror movie, except this was real. This was actually happening. The man's wailing abruptly ceased, and besides the harsh winds of the blizzard, no sound was made. I pulled out my phone and tried my best to shake the trembling in my hands as I dialed 911. As I waited for a response, I made sure all the doors were locked while I glued my eyes to the spot where I'd last seen the man. A pair of long indentations scarred the snow where he had lay, and a crimson handprint stained the black rubber of the front tire. Come on, pick up already," I harshly muttered to my phone, but I never made it past the dialing tone. Was it because I had no service? I've heard that many emergency lines still operate in spite of a poor phone signal, but right now, I was inclined to believe the contrary. I eventually gave up and put my phone down. I shrunk down into my seat, making myself as small as I could. I couldn't possibly tell you how long I sat there waiting like that. The concept of time felt irrelevant at that moment. In my reclined position, I still retained a decent line of sight to the outside world. There were no signs of movement, just an empty white canvas. I could hear no discernible sounds either. I watched in what felt like slow motion as each individually unique flake of snow landed and then proceeded to melt onto the glass. The windshield wipers fought the blizzard vigorously, brushing aside everything the malevolent storm had to offer. Then suddenly, with a squelched thud, something heavy crashed down on the window, and the wipers were now smearing a viscous red liquid back and forth across the windshield. A nearly indescribable sense of paralyzing horror drilled into my very soul as I realized what I was looking at. I immediately recognized the sorrowed eyes and contorted expression of pain that draped across the poor man's face. But the true horror of this scene lay not with the frightful sight that greeted me no more than 12 inches away, separated only by a cracked glass screen. No, the true horror presented itself after I finally mustered up the courage to ponder the question that I'm not even sure I wanted the answer to. Where was the rest of him? Upon the revelation that I was gazing at a human head, I was compelled to scream uncontrollably at the top of my lungs, and so I did. I couldn't help it. I felt nauseous and on the verge of vomiting. It took all my strength to gather any fragment of composure that had not yet left my body, and I quickly sat up in my seat, frantically scanning my surroundings. Still, I saw nothing except a heavy downpour of snow. I tried to calm down, as I knew that panicking would only worsen whatever situation was at hand. I steadied my breathing and sat still, slowly counting down from 10. However, the grotesque sight that greeted me whenever I looked through the windshield didn't exactly help, so I closed my eyes and continued counting, focusing on controlling my breathing. Inhale, exhale, exhale. But even as I closed my eyes, I still saw his face. The gruesome image had burned itself deep into my mind, and I felt anxious at the thought that I may never sleep peacefully again. In my distracted haze, I failed to notice that something foreign had filled the air, something ominous. It was a deep sound, barely audible, a stark contrast to the roaring winds outside. It was the kind of sound you feel rather than hear, if that makes sense. It was deep and bellowing, and I swear I could feel my chest faintly vibrate, like when you're at a concert or nightclub with a really loud bass. Carefully, I rolled down my window a quarter of the way in order to better hear the curious noise. It was much clearer now, and the best way to describe it would be to call it a sort of low-pitched rumble. Its tone fluctuated ever so slightly, as if in synchronization with short, rapid breaths. It would be a rather powerful display of vocal cords if the sound was of organic origin. I tried my best to pinpoint the direction from which the sound emanated, but I found the task to be near impossible. It may have been the wind distorting and dislocating the sound, but it sounded like it originated from every direction. I didn't know what to do. Obviously, I didn't want to exit the car and make a run for it like the previous motorists before me, but I felt that staying inside the car would only render me a sitting duck. I had no weapons to protect myself either, not even a pocket knife in the glove compartment. The only thing I had was an old Zippo lighter, which I doubted would do any real damage in a fight. The deep rumbling subsided, and was instead replaced by a hooting sound, reminiscent of that of an owl, only much deeper, like if someone blew air into a hollow tree trunk. But this sound was easy to pinpoint, and I could discern that it was coming from behind the car in front of me, where I had last seen the man before his untimely demise. I fixed my gaze toward the source of the sound, expecting to see its owner peeking around the edges of the vehicle at any moment, when I suddenly heard another, identical set of deep hooting coming from my left side. I wondered how the animal or creature, or whatever it was that made those sounds, had somehow managed to sneak past my line of sight and position itself to my left without me noticing. But my wondering was cut short when the original set of hoots in front once again started bellowing through the winter air, as if in response to the other ones. And to my utter dismay, I slowly began to realize that whatever was making those sounds, whatever had got that man, was not alone out here. And that's when I first saw it. As if on cue, I noticed the dominant silhouette standing in the middle of the road, contrasting itself against the rushing snowfall. Slowly emerging from the harrowing blizzard, just a few yards away from the car ahead, the creature revealed itself. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, an abominable middle finger to all of God's creations upon this earth. Its skull resembled that of a crocodile, resting well over 10 feet above the ground. It also had a large crest fixated right over its eyes, reminiscent of the horns of a bull. Its razor-sharp teeth were stained red, and red dripped down from its maw and onto the snow-covered asphalt. The entire creature was covered in dense white fur, like that of a polar bear. No wonder I hadn't spotted it until now. It was perfectly camouflaged among the powdery white snow. The rest of the body was hard to make out due to the storm, but I could tell it was huge, easily towering over the vehicle it slowly approached. It moved closer, trotting towards me in a jagged fashion. Blood still dripped from its malformed mouth. It almost looked to be smiling. Almost. I looked around the cabin of the car, once more desperately scouring for anything I could use to defend myself. Except for the bottle of liquor I had laying about, I was at a loss. At least I could ease the pain of being torn limb from limb by having a little alcohol in my system, I thought to myself. Seeing the creature uncomfortably close now, I made an attempt to just drive away. It was true what the officer had said previously about the road being extremely narrow, but in the face of certain death, I figured it was worth a shot. Though, as I was boxed in by both a car in my front and one in my rear, I would have to succeed at a difficult maneuver in order to make my escape. A maneuver I wasn't too sure I could make in these perilous conditions, but I had to try. I applied my foot down onto the gas pedal, and the tires spun around in the snow, slinging bits of debris everywhere. Still stationary, I pressed down even harder, hoping to God that I would break free from my frozen constraints. In my panic, I gazed ahead and locked eyes with the creature. I could feel its wicked stare burrow deep into my soul. The wheels kept spinning, but I wasn't making any progress. I had waited too long. It was as I had feared earlier. I was trapped. There was nowhere to go. An ear-splitting hoot sounded just a few yards away, and I saw the creature had stopped in its tracks. It raised its head and let out another hoot, What the hell do you want? I sobbed, punching the steering wheel in frustration. The wretched thing turned its head and let out yet another vocalization. It was as if it wanted to grab my attention or to distract me. Before I knew it, I felt a searing pain aching throughout my body, and my world was turned upside down as a powerful force slammed into the left side of the car, sending it flying. The SUV toppled over, accompanied by the sounds of crushing metal. Thankfully, I was wearing my seatbelt, or else I would have probably broken my neck while tumbling around inside the car like dirty laundry in a washing machine. When the car eventually came to a stop, I found myself suspended upside down in the driver's seat. The vehicle had rolled down into the nearby ditch on the side of the road. Below me, on the inside of the car's roof, were fragments of shattered glass and heaps of snow. I hadn't quite processed what had happened, so I sat there for a moment, taking it all in. Suddenly, everything felt so calm and quiet. I questioned if I had even survived the ordeal. A warm liquid flowed down from my chin into my mouth, and then down the rest of my face. The stinging copper taste made me snap out of my trance, and I began to assess the situation. Outside, I heard heavy thuds rapidly approaching the vehicle. Each mighty stomp struck down into the snow with rhythm, and I could imagine the creature's mouth practically foaming at the prospect of a fresh new meal. The footsteps came to a sudden halt right outside the driver's side window, and I turned my head to get a better look. A set of two large and powerful hind legs stood mere inches away from my face. They were covered in what looked to be reptilian-like scales lined with dense white fur, and the creature had 3 long talons that protruded from each foot. The deafening scraping of metal filled the air as I imagined the creature began clawing away at the undercarriage of the SUV. From the fast-paced shifting of the monster's feet, I began to understand the sheer ferocity with which it attacked. It was going ballistic, shredding the exterior at an incredibly fast rate. A combination of hoots and growls escaped its bloodthirsty jaws as it chipped away at the metal. It wouldn't be long until it was through. Another pair of heavy footsteps stopped just a short distance away on the opposite side of the car, right outside the passenger's side window. Like its predecessor, it too began clawing and kicking at the body of the car. The two creatures were relentless. I'd never seen anything like it. Not even wild hyenas were this ravenous. I braced for impact as I unbuckled my seatbelt, positioning myself in such a manner so that I wouldn't accidentally break my neck upon impact. I hit the ground hard and was greeted by the sensation of cold snow and broken glass. The car rocked back and forth as the creatures violently attacked. It was obvious I couldn't stay in here for long, but escaping the crushed remains of my vehicle and running out on foot didn't seem favorable either. I felt a deep desperation begin to set in as I realized I would most likely not live to see another day. This was it. Just as all hope had faded and I began to accept my fate, my arm brushed up against a cold and oblong object. I shifted my body around to see what it was, and a light bulb ignited inside my head as I gazed upon the still intact bottle of liquor that laid on the floor. My hands trembled as I reached deep into my pocket and extracted my old Zippo lighter. However, I examined the Jack Daniels and gauged that the contents inside would not be enough for the powerful reaction I was hoping for, so I opened the glove compartment and began searching. Ah, there it is! I cheered as my fingers grazed upon the bottle of scented hand sanitizer, an old relic from the pandemic. It was nearly full as well. I opened the 2 bottles and began pouring the disinfectant alcohol down into the half-empty liquor bottle. The sanitizer mixed in with the strong bourbon would surely be enough for an improvised Molotov cocktail. I ripped off a piece of cloth from my shirt and stuffed it down the bottleneck. With the Molotov in hand, I crawled toward the cracked windshield. I spun around and pressed my feet against the shattered glass frame. In an adrenaline-infused state, I pressed my legs down and applied pressure to the windshield. I strained my body and pushed my legs harder than I'd ever done before in my life, wishing I'd spent more time at the gym prior to this. Due to its severely damaged condition, it didn't take long before the windshield came off and the harsh winds of the outside world filled the cabin of the upside-down car. Above me, the creatures growled and bellowed, ripping and tearing away at the framework. I could see narrow slivers of light begin to penetrate the underside of the car, meaning they were nearly through. I crawled through the new opening and out into the unforgiving blizzard. I feared that as soon as I stepped outside, one of the creatures would promptly place my head in its jaws and I would be done for, but that never came. It seemed that they were too preoccupied with getting through the hard exterior of the SUV, and they had failed to notice that I had made my crafty escape. I kept crawling along the snow, praying to God that the beasts wouldn't turn their hideous heads and discover the easy meal slithering away right beside it. I didn't dare look back either. I couldn't bring myself to face the abominable animals. Once I had achieved a satisfactory distance away from the car, I finally turned around and rose to my feet. I ignited my lighter and set the Molotov cocktail ablaze. Don't try this at home, by the way. With all my remaining strength, I hurled the flaming bottle at the heap of scrap metal that used to be my car and watched in glory as the fire began to rise. I even think I hit one of the creatures as I heard a dazzled yelp cry out. The flames weren't nearly big enough to cause a massive explosion or anything, but it was just enough to distract the creatures so that I was able to make a run for it. I ran back onto the road and continued past all the vacant cars that stood further up. The ice was painted red and a couple of human corpses, or at least what remained of them, were strung about the various abandoned vehicles. Eventually I came upon the ambulance and the police car that had arrived about an hour prior. There were no signs of the officer who had talked to me, but deep down I knew what kind of fate had befallen him. In the distance, I heard ominous rumbling sounds coming from one of the creatures, followed by agitated hooting. Had they finally noticed I was gone? In that case, I didn't have a lot of time. I got inside the ambulance and planted myself down in the driver's seat. A frozen and severed human hand was attached to the steering wheel. I gagged as I ripped it off and tossed it out the open window. The creature's shrill cries echoed through the snowstorm, and it sounded like they were coming closer. Desperately, I turned the ambulance's ignition, and to my delight, it started up without a hitch. I kicked my foot down on the gas pedal and floored it out of there. Luckily for me, ambulances in this part of the United States come well equipped to handle hazardous terrain and snow-covered roads. As I drove, I intently watched the rearview mirror, hoping I would get a last glimpse of one of the monsters. But the only things I saw were whirling snowflakes dancing effortlessly along the icy winds that carried them. About 30 minutes of driving later, I arrived at a small town. The blizzard had begun to let up, and the sun was starting to set on the horizon. I parked outside the first roadside hotel I found, and must have looked like a zombie as I frantically begged the receptionist to alert the authorities. She looked extremely nervous, but did as I told her. After a while of talking, the kind receptionist informed me that the police would stop by first thing tomorrow morning. Apparently, the nearest police station was an hour's drive away, and the raging storm had caused major problems across infrastructure all over the state. Seeing as how nobody was in immediate danger, they would wait until the roads were cleared and traversal was safe again. I wasn't happy with this response, but I was too tired to really care. I checked into one of the hotel rooms and began typing all this out on my phone. There are still so many questions left unanswered, but I imagine tomorrow will bring more news about the situation. I just hope that the other motorists along that highway made it out okay, but I have my doubts. The blizzard has now subsided, and outside my second-story window, I am treated to a view of the clear night sky and the endless expanse of the tundra. I'll admit, this landscape is beautiful, though it is a shame that I will now forever associate the tranquility of snowfall with the abhorrent horror of events prior. However, that is not all. Since it was getting hot in my room, I decided to crack my window slightly ajar. For the past hour, I have been listening to the breeze floating across the frozen countryside. There are no sounds of wild animals out here, oddly enough, but there is something else. Occasionally in the distance, the silence is broken by the ever-so-familiar and foreboding sound of a faint hoot crying out into the night. I'll start by saying that I'm now an 18-year-old male who has had encounters with the supernatural ever since I was 8 years old, and I've had at least one experience every 3 years, so I'm pretty determined that there's a cycle. I'm a firm believer in the unexplained, growing up, and listening to people describe their encounters with Bigfoot and other supernatural creatures. However, listening to the stories and actually experiencing something are two very different ballgames. This incident happened back in November of 2022, when I was visiting a campground in Garibaldi, Oregon, on the coast with my choir class for a weekend excursion in order to get to know our classmates better. The camp we were at had 2 large 2-story group cabins, several trails, a mess hall with a basement, and other amenities. I will not disclose the name of the camp, but if you've been there, you've been there. The first day and night of the excursion went incredibly well, with us all getting to know each other, me having horrible luck asking out the girl I liked, and overall having a good time with my friends. However, when the sun went down, things changed dramatically. The atmosphere shifted, making everything eerie and unsettling. I didn't experience anything on the first night, but it was still very unsettling. I'll quickly add here that my classmates hadn't seen a single animal during the whole trip, not even birds or squirrels, which was already bizarre. The next day was pretty normal, with our class going through all of our scheduled activities as the day went on. Dinner rolled around, and before I knew it, everyone was back in the cabins and turning in for the night. However, I couldn't sleep for some reason. I decided that it would be best if I stepped outside onto the second-story balcony to help take my mind off of things when I felt the same thing I did the night before. That feeling of dread was coming back, as well as the feeling that there were eyes on me. The night was also deathly quiet, with only the sound of crashing waves on the beach accompanying me. But soon enough, that wasn't the only sound I was hearing. The sound came from the forest that ran parallel to the field that divided the two cabins, and it caused my body to immediately go into fight or flight and a chill to run down my spine. The sound in question was my own voice coming from the tree line. "Come here, I want to show you something." Whatever it was said in my voice, though it sounded slightly off like it had been recorded and played back, I originally thought that it was just a figment of my imagination, so I rubbed my ears, hoping that I wouldn't hear it again. But alas, it came again. "Come here, I want to show you something." Exactly how it sounded before. I then got out of there, remembering the many stories I heard of skinwalkers and how they can mimic voices. I ran into the cabin, closed the door that led to the balcony, locked the door and closed the window, hoping not to hear anything more. I fell asleep after an hour, only to wake at 4 o'clock in the morning. I heard a single heavy step make contact with the bottom step of the metal stairs that lead to the balcony. I ignored it and began blasting music into my ears through my headphones, drowning out any other noises of the night. I hoped this would be it, but the climax came on the third and final night of our trip. The next day, we went through the daily activities once more, and then night fell once again, but we would be spending the night, the last night of our trip, playing assassin, basically hide and seek in the woods. Before we got together to play, me and a decent-sized group of my classmates were hanging out in one of the larger fields, which had forest on 3 sides and the rest of the camp on the other. We were laying out under the stars when all of us heard it. It was a loud, shrill screech, sounding like it was coming from very far away. I was reminded at that moment that the further a skinwalker sounds from you, the closer it is, while the closer it sounds, the farther away it is. We then formed a defensive circle with our flashlights on bright, scanning the field and tree line, looking for anything out of the ordinary, yet we were able to locate nothing. It was tense for about a minute until our instructor and some other students came towards our circle with their flashlights on, ready to play assassin. We were assigned our roles and began to play, entered the woods, and began to play. Nothing happened during the games or for the rest of our trip, thank God. I only tell people about hearing my own voice as it's the easiest part of this series of events to describe to people. Not even my fiancé knows the full story, only about my own voice calling to me. If you ask the people in that defensive circle, they'll deny that even happened, that we simply wanted to stand like that in the field. Some of them will just flat out deny that they even heard the shrieks. I've consulted with my fiancé, who is a very rational person and looks at things from a scientific standpoint, trying to rule out all plausible explanations, and even she was completely stumped. She can't explain how I heard my own voice calling me, as I have no record of having auditory hallucinations. It was just bizarre. As I said earlier, I believe I had a run-in with a skinwalker or similar creature, but I guess I won't be able to find out, as I'm never going to return to that camp. If you decide to camp in the backwoods of Oregon, be careful and watch your back, because I full-heartedly believe that there are very dangerous things in this world that make people disappear. I will first say that this is not my first encounter with something unnatural, as I've had experiences with the supernatural before this. For some context, I'm a student at a government-funded trade school on the Pacific coast of the United States, and these occurrences have apparently been going on since before I even arrived on campus. I will state first that there are no wolves, coyotes, or stray dogs in the vicinity of the campus, but we do get a large number of wildlife from black-tailed deer, bald eagles, crows, gulls, and raccoons, as well as other critters. My first experience with this entity was around 2 months ago, while I was living in my first dorm room close to midnight. The room was the last room in the hall, and the large window faced the thick forest that surrounded the campus. One night, while I was laying in bed while my roommate was asleep in the bed next to me, when I heard an odd sound coming from the hallway outside of our room. It sounded like claws clacking against the tile floor, a sound I was used to hearing as my parents had a dog back home whose claws would clack on the hardwood floor. These sounded much heavier, though, and put me on edge as we weren't even allowed to have dogs on center, and that went for the staff as well. And like I said earlier, there are no wild canids here. So this was utterly bizarre. Why were these footfalls occurring? And in the building itself? I was deeply concerned, so I woke my roommate and explained to him what I had heard. I thought he wouldn't believe me, but surprisingly he did. "You heard it too?" he said as I opened the door and looked into the hallway, only to find nothing. I remember asking him what he meant, and he proceeded to explain how we had heard the same clacking at least 3 times around the same time, and he even described hearing deep howls echoing in the night. We began discussing and hypothesizing on what we were both experiencing, and concluded that we were both experiencing hellhound activity after ruling out all plausible and natural possibilities. Our campus has a rich history of tragedy and loss, all within the past 90 years of our campus's existence, which we felt was attracting negative entities like our suspected hellhound onto center. I then began asking around after determining our culprit, trying to see if anyone else had encountered or had an experience with what we had dubbed the hound. There was actually a surprising number of people who had experienced the activity we did, and even a guy who had even seen it. By the time I finished asking around, I had at least 12 individuals from the dorms who had experiences with the hound. I wrapped up our investigation, and things went back to normal for about a week until the weekend rolled around. I was laying in bed again with the window open when I finally heard the sound I had been anticipating ever since my roommate explained the howls he'd heard. It was the howl, deep and guttural, just like he had described. I told my roommate in the morning, and he believed me, telling me that he'd even been awake and heard it too. I've even consulted with my fiancée, who looks at things through a critical scientific standpoint, and even she came up short with determining the identity of what we had experienced. I'm fairly certain that this is still a hellhound, or at least another type of ghost dog, but my roommate and I have since moved out of that room, and I haven't experienced any activity since. I was a night owl, always had been. My most productive hours fell when the world was silent and shrouded in darkness. It was during these hours that I wrote my stories, played my video games, and most importantly, made my living. I worked for Uber Eats in Los Angeles, a job that suited my nocturnal lifestyle perfectly. This story begins on a humid summer night. I had just finished delivering a late-night pizza to a college kid studying for his exams. As I drove back to the more bustling part of town, I noticed a new order popping up on my phone. It was an address I didn't recognize, nestled in an older, less traveled part of the city. It was a place few people ventured after dark. But an order was an order, and I accepted it. The order was simple, a single cheeseburger from a fast food joint. As I picked up the order, the server gave me a peculiar look. "That's a long way to go for a burger," she said, looking at the delivery address on her screen. I shrugged it off, attributing her concern to the lateness of the hour and the remote location of the delivery address. I thanked her and headed out, the aroma of the freshly cooked burger filling my car. The journey to the address was eerie. The further I went, the less familiar the surroundings became. The vibrant, crowded streets of LA gave way to narrower, desolate roads, shrouded in shadows and an oppressive silence. The city's soundscape faded into a background hum, replaced by the haunting whispers of wind through the skeletal trees lining the road. As I turned onto the street, indicated by my GPS, a chilling sense of unease crept over me. The houses here were old and decrepit, their boarded-up windows and overgrown lawns indicative of a long-abandoned neighborhood. It was as if I had stepped into a ghost town within the heart of the metropolis. My headlights landed on the house matching the delivery address. It was a dilapidated 2-story building, the chipped paint and crumbling facade adding to its eerie appearance. But what unsettled me most was its windows. They were not boarded up like the others, instead covered by old, faded curtains that seemed to shift ever so slightly. A sensible person would have turned back, but the reality of my financial situation compelled me to carry out the task. I got out of my car, the cheeseburger in hand, and approached the house. The overgrown weeds crunched under my shoes, the sound unnaturally loud in the unsettling silence. I knocked on the door, the sound echoing through the hollowed-out house. As I waited for a response, a chill ran down my spine. There was something profoundly wrong about this place, an ominous aura that I couldn't shake. And then the unthinkable happened. The door creaked open on its own, revealing an enveloping darkness within. "Hello!" I called out, my voice tremulous, swallowed up by the darkness inside. An unsettling stillness hung in the air, broken only by the distant echo of my own words. I was about to turn around, my instincts screaming at me to get out of there, when a voice drifted out from within the house. "Just leave it by the door, thank you." The voice was old and raspy, an underlying tone of weakness evident in its timbre. Sympathy momentarily dampened my fear, as I realized this could be an elderly person unable to cook for themselves. I put the bag down near the entrance, took a picture to confirm delivery, and hurried back to my car. As I drove away, I glanced back at the house. The front door was still open, the burger untouched. The following night, a new order buzzed on my phone. My blood ran cold as I saw the same address from last night. It was the same order, a single cheeseburger. With a deep sigh, I accepted the order. I tried to convince myself that there was nothing to worry about. An elderly person in need was depending on me. As I turned onto the same abandoned street, my hands were shaking slightly. The sight of the house, bathed in the cold glow of my headlights, did nothing to ease my anxiety. Gathering my courage, I approached the house and left the cheeseburger by the front door. This time, no voice acknowledged me, and the door remained closed. Days turned into a week, and every night the order from the old house came in like clockwork. Each time I left a cheeseburger by the front door, and each time there was no response. My initial fear turned into an uncomfortable routine, the mystery of the old house and its unseen occupant never leaving my thoughts. On the 8th night, things changed. The voice, frail and weak, called out again as I set down the cheeseburger. Could you come in and place it on the table? I'm not feeling well." Against my better judgment, I pushed the door open and stepped into the house. The air was stale, heavy with the smell of decay and damp wood. I strained my eyes to adjust to the darkness, flicking on the flashlight on my phone. The narrow beam cut through the shadows, illuminating a pathway strewn with old, tattered furniture and cobwebs. I placed the burger on a rickety table and backed out, not daring to explore further. As I drove away, the feeling of unease was stronger than ever, the image of the decaying interior imprinted in my mind. The house was not fit for habitation, yet someone was living there, surviving off of a single cheeseburger every night. But who were they? And why did they choose to live this way? And most importantly, why did I feel an uncanny sense of dread every time I stepped foot on that property? As the nights wore on, I realized I was about to discover answers that I may not be prepared for. My nights became plagued by nightmares, the old house taking on monstrous proportions in my sleep-addled mind. I would be back in the decaying living room, the weak voice whispering unseen, leading me deeper into the bowels of the house. I would wake up drenched in sweat, the echoes of the whisper still resonating in my ears, and still, the orders kept coming. I started to dread the pings on my phone as night fell, knowing that inevitably, one of them would lead me back to the old house. Each visit felt like I was intruding into a story I wasn't meant to be a part of, an uninvited character in a slowly unfurling horror tale. On the 12th night, my worst fears came to pass. As I laid the cheeseburger at the front door, the voice drifted out, sounding weaker than ever. "Can you please bring it to me?" I hesitated at the entrance, every instinct screaming at me to refuse, but the pleading tone in the voice tugged at my humanity. Swallowing hard, I stepped into the dimly lit interior. The house seemed to groan around me as I walked deeper, following the voice that was now a barely audible whisper. My heart pounded in my chest as I moved past rotting furniture, the beam of my phone's flashlight bouncing off peeling wallpaper and bare wooden floors. Finally, I reached a dilapidated door at the end of a long, narrow hallway. With a trembling hand, I pushed the door open. Inside was a figure, huddled under threadbare blankets on an old bed, the room reeking of decay and neglect. "Over here." The figure lifted a frail hand, gesturing to a bedside table. I placed the burger there, my eyes never leaving the shadowy form under the blankets. As I turned to leave, the voice stopped me. "Thank you." Something in the tone, a mix of relief and sorrow, rooted me to the spot. I found myself asking the question that had been gnawing at me for days. "Who are you?" There was a pause, the silence stretching on until it felt unbearable. Then the figure under the blanket stirred. Just an old man, waiting to be forgotten. I left the house that night with a heavy heart, the sadness in the old man's voice haunting me. As I continued to deliver the cheeseburgers night after night, I began to feel a sense of duty, a need to ensure that this lonely soul was not forgotten. But with each visit, the atmosphere in the house grew more oppressive, the sense of dread escalating into tangible fear. I started to hear things, whispers in the silence, sighs in the creaking wood, laughter in the rustling wind. The house was alive, its malignant energy growing stronger with each passing night, until one night the cheeseburger order didn't come in, nor the next night, nor the night after that. I found myself driving past the house anyway, a sick feeling of worry gnawing at me. On the fourth day, I summoned the courage to enter the house. The silence inside was deafening, the usual whispering voice absent. I moved towards the room, my heart pounding. As I pushed open the door, the sight that greeted me made my blood run cold. The bed was empty, the room colder than ever. But what truly terrified me was the state of the room. It looked untouched and used for years, no sign that the frail, dying man had ever been there. In my heart, I knew I'd been delivering meals to a ghost, a lingering spirit tied to the old house, and I was part of his unfinished story. Fear took a back seat to an overwhelming sadness as I realized the truth. The urban legend of the old haunted house wasn't just a legend after all, and the ghost, the lonely old man, was finally at rest. As I left the house for the final time, I could swear I heard a whisper on the wind, an ethereal voice saying, "Thank you." The haunted Uber Eats house remained as a chilling reminder of my encounter with the supernatural, a tale that would haunt my dreams for a long time to come. 2 years ago, I finished my degree at a university in Massachusetts. It's a prestigious institution with a rich history, and I decided to stay on and try to work on a master's. My major is in physics, with a specialism in electrical engineering, and towards the end of my fourth year, I spent a lot of time networking and socializing with doctors and professors, hoping to land a good graduate program. Now, a few decades ago, some bright spark who had somehow got himself to be university president decided that administration would be much easier if the departments were alphabetized rather than grouped by faculty. He reorganized half the campus before the end of his tenure. He left physics in place, since the building has had significant work to be suitable for the subject. And now, physics is next to psychology, parapsychology, and paranormal studies. Go figure. This meant that the cafeteria a minute's walk from the physics building also serves those other departments, and it can often be hard to discern somebody's subject by looking. At least, that's my excuse for when I met Dr. Caruso. I got chatting to him in the line for lunch and mentioned that I was an electrical engineer looking for a master's supervisor. Caruso's eyes lit up. He was a tall man, thin and wiry. He claimed to be a Bostonian Italian, but he had no accent, and I doubt he could have pointed to Italy on a map. He told me he had a project he was working on, a new type of battery, and he really needed an electrical engineer to help him. He even had a budget that would stretch to my entire tuition. I said yes almost immediately. He brought the paperwork to my lab the next day, and we signed. He wanted me to start right away, but I hadn't even finished my finals, and besides, I wanted a break from studying. Reluctantly, he agreed that if he could send me over some specifications for me to think through, he could wait until August. So that's what I did. I really did want a break, but when I and a few friends took off to Europe for a couple of weeks after exams, I downloaded the specs to my tablet and ended up studying them for a couple of hours most days, sometimes in our hostel room, sometimes by a pool or a cafe. What Caruso wanted was mostly very sensible, unusual, but logical. Essentially, it was a way of collecting energy from work, converting it into electric current, and storing it in a battery. What made it weird was that he wanted to collect energy from a large number of tiny fluctuations, and those fluctuations were varied. Normally, you would choose one, convert the motion of a fluid with a turbine, extract work from a heat differential with a Stirling engine, convert pressure into electrical current via the piezoelectric effect, and so on. Caruso wanted all of these and more, but in a tiny package an inch or two across. Essentially, it looked like he was trying to squeeze every last bit of available energy out of the environment at microscale, but with the capability of scaling up to an arbitrary size. While I was on holiday, I was determined not to call Caruso, or even email him. I still managed to fill 3 notebooks of diagrams and calculations before I got back to the US in the middle of August. So excited was I to get working on this project. It was a lot of work, and I spent months tinkering before a problem arose. Jenny, one of the administrators in the physics department, called me into her office. She asked me about the procurement forms I'd been submitting and who they were for. I explained, showing her the paperwork I had with Caruso's signature on it. It was only then that I learned Caruso was, in fact, not a physicist. He was in paranormal studies. We'd met in the lab plenty of times and had meetings and discussions in the cafeteria, but I realized I'd never actually been to his office. I excused myself and called my supervisor, asking him to explain himself. He arrived at Jenny's office about 20 minutes later, apologized for the misunderstanding, and arranged for money to be transferred over to cover the costs. Jenny was happy, but I was not. I asked him to come to the lab to check on something, closed the door, and gave him an earful. I don't think the closed door did much for privacy. I showed none of the respect usually due to your supervisor, and even the radio astronomers on the roof could probably hear me. Surprisingly, Caruso was not upset or angry. He didn't raise his voice. He just waited until I'd run out of steam, which took quite a while. Then he looked at me, said, "I'm sorry," and invited me to his office in Para. I'd never actually been to the Paranormal Studies building. For all its spooky reputation and the occasional weird rumors coming out of there, it looked very respectable. I don't think the building had been redecorated since the department had moved there in the 80s, but it was clean, well-kept, and a lot tidier than most of the physics building. If you didn't read the titles of the books on the shelves, it could have been mistaken for psychology or mathematics, or even an accountant's or lawyer's offices. Caruso's office was much the same. He had an old but nice wooden desk with a desktop computer and half a dozen books pulled from the shelves behind it. But apart from a half-empty coffee mug, everything was very clean. He even had a couple of armchairs in there. In physics, you're lucky to get an office chair with wheels. He took one chair and I took the other, and I felt like we should break out smoking pipes and discuss classic literature. Of course, that's not what we did. Caruso apologized again and promised to tell me exactly what he was doing. It was about ghosts. It took every ounce of restraint in my body not to roll my eyes. I resolved to let him finish talking, the same courtesy he had granted me half an hour earlier, and then make up my mind. Ghosts, he explained, may or may not exist. But that wasn't the point. Alleged hauntings most certainly do exist and exhibit physical manifestations. Whether they are environmental or paranormal, these effects are real, and ghost hunters have been measuring them since the 19th century. But until now, nobody has thought to harness them. People who claim to have experienced hauntings describe sudden changes in air temperature, strange sounds, and feelings of dread. More macroscopic effects might include wind or even objects moving of their own volition. All of these, Caruso told me, could be harnessed to provide energy. Feelings of dread? I asked, breaking the promise to myself not to interrupt. Caruso explained that skeptics have written this off as a number of different phenomena, but are generally keen on infrasound, sound at a frequency too low for human hearing, but that can nevertheless be sensed. Back in the 80s, a British researcher had experienced a haunting in a lab, as had several other people who worked there. He eventually traced it down to a faulty extractor fan emitting infrasound. He got it fixed, and the haunting stopped. This was a physical phenomenon with a simple explanation, but still, one that could be used to extract energy. Caruso continued like this for some time. I was getting increasingly skeptical about the work. You could make an interesting gadget for party tricks, but I couldn't see how our device could possibly draw enough environmental power to charge a phone, let alone supply an entire house. Caruso urged me to continue the work, replying that even if it didn't result in anything practical, I'd still come out with a master's thesis. So I kept going. It was well into my second year before I had something really usable. A square of miniaturized electronics 2 inches wide that could, at best, draw 0.3 megawatts of power from the environment. And so last November, I carried my equipment to Caruso's office for a demonstration. Despite its age, Paranormal Studies has much better environmental controls than the physics labs. We control the environment in small containers for our experiments. They control the environment for the comfort of their staff. This is nice, but it meant my galvanometer barely went above 0.1 megawatts. Still, this was enough for Caruso to let out a little shriek of excitement. When can we test it in the field? I told him that a single module had a maximum power rating of 20 megawatts. It was a prototype and far from optimized, but I'd done some calculations that showed that to power a typical US household, at best we would need so many of these connected in parallel that the final product would be the size of a large fridge. Caruso pointed out, quite correctly, that this is exactly why he'd recruited an electrical engineer, and that something the size of a fridge was a good trade-off for having electricity and fuel bills of zero. But, I replied, even if I could get the maximum power up, there simply wasn't the energy available in the environment to reach anywhere near that maximum. Caruso gave me a sly look, The kind of look your co-conspirator might give you, except I wasn't in on the conspiracy. Just work on the electronics, have it ready by March 1st. I'll sort out the environmental problem. Well, this guy was paying my entire tuition, and the budget he'd arranged with Jenny was several times higher than most grad students in physics. Over the next few months, I worked on an improved prototype, figured out how to automate much of the production, and built an aggregation system to route all the power to a central supply point. On my March deadline, I had a device about the size of a backpack, and indeed, I fitted it all into a backpack for easy transport. I was regularly pulling upwards of 500 megawatts in the right conditions, but nowhere near the theoretical maximum of 200 watts, enough to power a small LED from a device that could almost run a hairdryer. When I showed this to Caruso, he delightfully declared, "It's ready." "Ready for what?" I asked. "A proper test. Bring it here tonight. I'll meet you on the steps outside the department at 7. So I did. In the last light of the evening, we got into Caruso's car and set off. There are a lot of very old buildings in town, many dating back to pre-Civil War, and of course, this means lots of ghost stories. I've never gone in for that much, but I recognize the house we parked in front of. I've passed it plenty of times, and in the summer, it's not uncommon to see a tour guide talking about it to a group of tourists, or sometimes locals on a workplace evening out. The house is 3 stories tall, with wood paneling on the outside. The windows are small, with diagonal grids, I think made of lead, except for a couple that have been smashed and boarded up. Nobody has lived there for quite some time, and it shows. There is a small yard out front, mostly overgrown, and it took us a bit of effort to maneuver through the path to the front door. To my surprise, the door was locked. Caruso, apparently having anticipated this, brought out a crowbar from his inside coat pocket. I was slightly alarmed at how easily he broke in, and made a mental note to ask him later how a paranormal studies researcher is so adept at B&E. But right now I had another burning question. "You actually want us to draw power from a haunted house?" "Well," he said, pushing the busted door open, "we don't know that it's haunted, but we do know that several people have reported strange disturbances. Do you know the history of this place?" I confessed that I didn't. In the 1780s, a wealthy family lived here. They made their living by insuring ships engaged in the transatlantic slave trade. Supposedly, the daughter objected, finding her father's trade unconscionable. A neighbor's diary records some of the loud arguments he overheard, often lasting for hours. Then one day, the daughter died, just 17 years old. The cause of death was officially recorded as typhus, but neighbors record that there was a particularly angry exchange between father and daughter. Her voice raised more than you'd expect from a person dying of fever. When they brought her body out of the house, there were several bystanders watching, some of whom claimed they saw blood on her clothes and knife wounds. We were inside at this point, looking around a dimly lit hallway. Caruso lit an electric lamp. The well-to-do back then had little they enjoyed more than gossip, and the family quickly got a reputation. The father had murdered his daughter, the mother was in on it, that sort of thing. We'll never know exactly what happened, but we do know that a year later, on the anniversary of her daughter's passing, the mother took her own life. Caruso pointed to the just there. "This is exactly why I never joined those tour groups. I hate this stuff." The couple had 2 children. With the daughter and mother gone, the father and son were alone in the house. Things got strained. Apparently the son blamed his father for both of the deaths, and their arguments often turned physical. The boy, about 14 at the time, was often seen hiding his face to try to cover the bruises. This went on for about a year. He paused for a second. Exactly a year. 1 year after the mother took her own life, 2 years after the daughter passed mysteriously, a fire started in the house. The building was gutted, and by the time they managed to put the fire out, the father was dead. They never found the boy. Caruso had also brought a backpack with him, and now he was carefully laying out its contents. He had crystals, chalk, feathers, salt, all sorts of rubbish you might find in a New Age shop. He seemed to be arranging them in some sort of pattern, and when he was done, he started drawing shapes on the wooden floor with the chalk. This clearly needed some concentration, but that only slowed his speech. He continued, "This is a good location, and the shell of the house that remained was reasonably sturdy. So years later, somebody bought the site from the estate, some grandniece, I think, who lived in Boston, and rebuilt it, more or less brick for brick, plank for plank. They came from out of town, New York, I think, so they weren't aware of the history, only that there had been a fire. They were a family of 6. It's a big house, 3 daughters and 1 son, very pleasant by all accounts. The children were young, and went to school locally. Their teachers are on record saying they had concerns. He left the house then. I walked around the ground floor. There were minimal facilities, a kitchen, dining room, and living room, but no furniture. I saw a few electrical outlets, 2 per room, with decaying and yellowing plastic. I doubt any of them worked. Caruso returned with several waist-height candlesticks. Where was I? He placed the sticks in a neat circle. Oh, right, the kids. So written records from the school say that the children were weird. They always looked tired and complained that they couldn't sleep. Apparently the younger girls drew frightening faces, and the boy told his teacher that he didn't like the women he lived with. The teacher asked if he meant his sisters or his mother, and he said no. It was the other women. They wouldn't let him sleep, and they told him everything was his fault. Eventually things came to a head. The girls' school told the parents their daughters had been frightening the other girls, and they wouldn't be welcome anymore. Back then, good schools were few and far between, and soon enough the family had packed up and gone back to New York, or wherever. He now began placing candles on the candlesticks. That was back in, I think, the 1860s. The house has changed hands a few times since then, but nobody has stayed more than a year or two. It's been empty most of the time. The last people lived here in 1978, I think. They left without saying anything, but a reporter caught up with them in the 90s. They said that they heard crying every night, and their goldfish always died a few days after they bought them. Even squatters and homeless people stay away these days. The house was unheated and poorly insulated on that spring evening. Maybe that's why a chill ran through my body. Maybe that's why I got goosebumps, and that whispering noise I thought I heard. Well, it's not like those old walls were any good at keeping the wind out, right? Caruso stood back from his handiwork and actually rubbed his hands together. It's ready. Ready for what? I asked, already knowing the answer. He gave me a look like I was stupid, so I brought the micropower plant out of my backpack and set it up in the center of the arcane construction he'd built. It was fully dark outside by now, and it took half an hour to adjust the various settings on my equipment. While I'd been setting it up, Caruso had pulled out 2 oil-fired storm lanterns and set them up either side of his ridiculous ghost apparatus. He turned the electric lamp off. This made sense, as my galvanometer was sensitive enough to read the electromagnetic field of the lamp if he moved it. He turned his phone off, and I did the same. There was just enough light to read the display. For a long time, it varied between about 300 and 500 megawatts, about average for my tests. We sat there watching it for about an hour before it started to rise. 600, 700, 800 megawatts. That was the highest I'd ever recorded. And it went further. Over just a couple of minutes I watched as the reading increased. 900, 1000, 1000, 100 megawatts. I heard a sound. I'd never heard anything like it, and I haven't in the months since, except in my nightmares. It was like a gale of wind, filled with whispers, almost intelligible, the sort of sound where you know it makes sense, but you can't quite figure it out yourself. And above it, a shrill scream of terror, though whether the sound was the result or the cause of terror, I can't say. My blood ran cold, and I felt my feet rooted to the spot. I had just enough wherewithal left in me to look at the display. It was stable now, 2,800 megawatts. This was almost exciting enough for me to ignore the sounds, which were surely just the wind rushing through the upper floors above us, and I may have been able to calm myself had I not witnessed what happened next. The candles flickered. I distinctly remembered that they all rose up and blew outwards, away from the center, and in the middle of them was a face, a woman's face, but about twice as big as a face should be, and it was clear that the screaming was coming from her. The candles and the storm lanterns blew out. I could see nothing. Seconds earlier, my fight-flight-freeze instincts had settled on freeze. Now they switched modes. I turned and ran for the door. It was only a few feet behind me, and despite the pitch darkness, I found it and pushed it open, only to remember that it opened inwards. Panic rising in my guts, I fumbled for the door handle for what felt like an eternity, grasped it, yanked open the door, and tumbled out into the path. I ran to the end of the street before I dared look back. Caruso was there, calmly walking to his car with my device in his hands. He got in and turned the engine on, dazzling me with his bright headlights, and drove my way. When he reached me, he opened the passenger window. Need a lift? I have no idea how he was so calm. I just wanted to run far, far away. My legs were like jelly, though, and I didn't think I could even make it all the way home. Caruso dropped me off, said he'd call me tomorrow, and headed away into the darkness. I didn't go into the lab the next morning. I had barely had any sleep and really didn't want to talk about it, but around 10, Caruso called me. I refused to go in, so he invited himself round to mine. I wish I'd walked home rather than let him know where I live. I almost didn't open the door when he arrived. I led him into the hallway, but no further. He was very excited, speaking rapidly, and more energetic than I'd ever seen him before. When he started talking about returning, I told him point blank that I was out. There was no way I was ever stepping foot in that house again, and he could stick his power plant. Well, you get the idea. Money isn't everything. Remember that. No matter how much somebody wants to pay you, some things are just not worth it. Caruso brought a brown paper packet out of his jacket and handed it to me. I opened it. It was full of 50s. $10,000. Call it hazard pay. Just one more test. Tomorrow night. Then you never need to go back. You can finish your master's in the lab. No more field trips. Even with my tuition covered, I was barely making my rent. 10,000 would pay off my debts and cover my costs to the end of my master's, maybe more. I accepted. I spent the next 2 days making adjustments to the device. It drew multiple watts in the previous test, enough to power a small light bulb, so I built a new display, a 10 by 10 grid of bulbs which would come on in sequence to show the power draw. One bulb would be 2 watts, and all 100 would be the maximum 200 watts. I met Caruso in front of Paranormal Studies around 7 on March 3rd, and we set off once more to that cursed house. It looked just as it had 2 nights earlier. The door was still busted open, and we set everything up the same way as before. I came prepared this time. I had secretly hidden several flashlights in my pockets, as well as some high-intensity light sticks I'd got from a hardware store, and I had a pair of thermal imaging goggles I'd borrowed from the lab. I wore them on my forehead, turned off to avoid causing interference with the device. They were only for emergencies. I'd considered a weapon, but what use would that be against a ghost? Besides, I told myself, ghosts aren't real. We had been in the dark, in an eerie house with a bad reputation, and Caruso had just told me a spooky story. In that state of mind, of course, my brain would conjure up a phantom face. I remembered how he had been so calm walking out of the house. No doubt he hadn't seen anything, and it was all just my imagination. I turned on the device to test it before Caruso had lit the candles. I was getting 1,200 megawatts already, and the first bulb was clearly visible in the darkness. He then lit the candles one by one, and I watched the power increase. The heat engines in the device should be able to draw something from the candles, but only about 20 megawatts. The second bulb lit up, then the third, then the fourth, over 8 watts. Again I heard whispering. No, I told myself, it's just the wind. It was the wind 2 days ago, and it's the wind now. The power draw was steady now, with 7 bulbs lit up, still a long way from maximum, but far more than it had any right to be. Something suddenly occurred to me. Caruso, I said, fearing the reply. That girl died on a certain date. Then the mother died on the same date a year later. Then the house burned down. Yeah, that's right, he replied. March 3rd, tonight. Damn ghost stories. What are we getting? How could he be so calm? I told him we were on 15 watts. Not enough. I was worried about this. The ghosts are too old. We need something fresher. That didn't sound good. I was getting seriously worried and questioning whether all this was worth $10,000. Caruso went back to his bags and pulled out a small plastic box. Inside was a mouse, and while I decided against weapons, he had apparently brought a 6-inch knife. What? Caruso, no. I shouted, but it didn't help. He took the mouse, which was just waking up, to the middle of the circle and took its life. The wailing sounds, that I'd been so desperate to pretend had just been the wind, intensified. The candle flames flickered and grew, and I saw blue lights streaming out of the mouse's corpse, like ribbons fluttering in the wind. More bulbs lit up. The second row was partly on now. We were pulling 25 watts of power, and it stayed there. My heart was pounding. Adrenaline pumped through my veins. Somehow I managed not to turn and flee. I turned on my thermal goggles. They would make next to no difference to such a high-power draw. The room was mostly dark, but the candle flames, bulbs, Caruso, and slowly cooling mouse cadaver were bright white. Still not enough, said the glowing thermal image of Caruso. A mouse isn't going to cut it, if you'll pardon the expression. What? What are you saying? You want to kill 20 mice over these things, then sell them in a department store? No, spectral energy doesn't work like that. 2 mice wouldn't work. It needs to be one large sacrifice. Something with a bigger soul, if you will. What the hell was Caruso talking about? He said nobody had tried this before, but who knows what he'd read in those kooky books on his shelves. Then it dawned on me. He meant people. He wanted to build hundreds of these, thousands, and kill a human being over each one. 2 centuries earlier, the house had been the scene of a violent confrontation over the ethics of slavery. Now history repeated itself, except somehow this lunatic had managed to find something even worse. He argued that these devices could halt global warming and stop oil wars. I argued that murder was wrong, no matter what. He said it would save more lives than it cost. I shouted him down, called him evil, a psychopath. Even more animated than before, Caruso stepped closer. He got right in my face and yelled that we had to do this. I pushed him away. He pushed me back. I aimed a punch at him. He dodged and hit me in the face. This knocked my goggles off. Oh, how I wish he had done anything else. The ghosts hadn't shown up in infrared, but now I saw them clear as day. A young woman, an older woman, and a man with charred and blackened skin. All of them were glowing in the darkness, standing just 10 feet away, watching the fight. Then I noticed something I hadn't realized. Caruso was still holding the knife. I had to get it out of his hand before he decided to use me as his next test subject. I want to grab it. He swung it at me, and I leaped out of the way just in time. I'm not sure exactly what happened next. There was a scuffle. Either he grabbed me, or I grabbed him, and we wrestled for a few moments until suddenly Caruso stopped fighting. He staggered back, blood gushing from his abdomen. I looked down. Somehow, during the struggle, I had got the knife, which was now in my blood-soaked hands. Caruso fell to his knees, just inside the circle. He tried to say something, but I couldn't make it out. Then he slumped to the ground. The screaming intensified. Blue light streamed from his corpse, flooding the room. The light bulbs all lit up brighter than ever. As I turned to run, the candles blew out and the bulbs pushed far beyond their capacity, exploded all at once. I grabbed the door handle, clearly lit up in the bright blue light, opened the door and ran. It was about midnight, and I got home without anybody seeing my bloody hands. Nothing followed me from the house. That's probably my only good news. The next morning, after I'd got over the 5 shots of whiskey, I had to calm myself down. I called a lawyer, and then the police. Everybody knew I was working with Caruso, and his car was parked outside the house. It wouldn't be hard to connect the dots when he was reported missing. I'm being charged with involuntary manslaughter. I told the police everything, with a few obvious exceptions. Seeing that I'd voluntarily turned myself in and cooperated with the police, the judge set a low bail. Ironically, she put it at $10,000 and I got a friend to pick up the package from my house. My court date is in a few months, and my lawyer says I've got a good chance of claiming self-defense. I might not have to spend a single night in prison, but the university kicked me out. My device is in police evidence, and I haven't had a restful night's sleep in months. I wake up screaming most nights, and I pray that the visions I see sometimes in the day are just trauma rather than the ghosts of that family and Dr. Caruso and the mouse. Last summer, my parents took my brother, Aaron, and I on a family holiday to Spain. It was something my parents had been planning for a while, but wanted to keep it a surprise for us kids. Aaron and I weren't told about it until 2 days before we were due to leave. We were ecstatic to leave our home in Scotland and trade in a couple of weeks for some sunshine and hot weather. 2 days later, we were at the airport eagerly awaiting our flight. It had been years since we went anywhere as a family because it's difficult finding someone to watch our pets. At least when you have 8 dogs, it is. After arriving at our destination, Mom picked up a rental car and we were on our way to the hotel we would be staying at. We didn't do much on our first night other than unpack and go out to dinner. Just before tucking into bed early, we all agreed to meet in the lobby the next morning at 10. The next morning came, and I was the last to arrive. I didn't know what was planned for the day, but Aaron and I followed our parents to the car and got in. I asked where we were going, but all I got from Mom was it's a surprise. About an hour and a nap later, we stopped at what I thought to be the middle of nowhere, just some empty land with a few trees and overgrown grass. I checked the time on my phone and saw that it was already close to noon. Aaron looked just as confused as I was until Dad said, "Mom and I bought this plot of land. It's ours." Dad was always talking about eventually buying a plot of land somewhere and fixing it up for different business ideas, but to be honest, I never thought he'd actually go through with it. Why in Spain of all places? I swear I never understood that man. None of us did. Mom stepped in and said, "I brought lunch with us, so why don't you guys look around for a bit while I get everything set up and we'll have a nice picnic." As strange as it all was, I was still kind of excited. I mean, I know there wasn't really a whole lot to look at, but maybe I'd find something cool lying on the ground somewhere. I was even open to finding a nice rock to take home with me. Aaron and I wandered around for a minute while Mom was getting everything out of the trunk. Before going too far, I caught a quick glimpse of some fresh strawberries, mine and Aaron's favorite, as long as they're accompanied with a good tart. Suddenly in the distance I saw what appeared to be an old building, but I was certain that there wasn't anything there before. Aaron, look over there. I pointed ahead. Let's go check it out. He agreed, but reminded me not to keep Mom and Dad waiting too long. As we edged closer, we realized it was another hotel. This one, however, was very clearly old and had been abandoned for quite some time. Vines covered the crumbling building. There was no telling how long it had been since it had seen any guests. I took my phone out so I could take a few pictures. I loved taking snaps of old buildings. The longer I stood there, the more I felt compelled to get even closer. I needed to see the inside. Aaron felt the same way. What we saw after opening the doors to the hotel lobby was jaw-dropping. Everything inside was in pristine condition. It was grand and luxurious, and it was surely worthy of a 5-star rating. It was the kind of hotel that only the richest could indulge in. My brother and I were the only people inside. It was as if everyone just simply walked out. We couldn't believe it. I had to take more pictures. We searched around for any sign of life, but to no avail. Suddenly, the elevator door opened with a ping signaling that it was ready for us to get in. You would think that getting on would be a bad idea, and it was, but as I mentioned earlier, I felt compelled to get in. Aaron and I slowly got in, and before we could press any buttons, the doors swiftly closed and took us to the first floor. It was when we got out that we smelled something delicious. We followed the smell until we stood in front of a set of swinging doors. Aaron stood next to me, and we looked at each other before slowly pushing the doors open. We were immediately hit with a mouth-watering aroma. Inside was a busy dining room. Dozens of people sat at tables with friends and family while enjoying their meals. Smiles and laughter filled the room. Everyone was happy and lost in their own conversations. No one seemed to pay any attention to us as we made our way over to the buffet table. Everything looked heavenly. Aaron was almost in a trance-like state as he went to grab a fresh strawberry tart from the dessert tray. I quickly grabbed his arm. Wait! Don't forget about what happened in the movie Spirited Away. He shook his head and snapped out of his trance. Let's get out of here, he said. As we walked away, the room suddenly filled with music. It was quiet, but the melody was calm and relaxing, enticing even. I wanted to get my phone back out, but I feared that if I didn't leave right then and there, I never would. We spotted another way out on the other side, and didn't waste any time getting the hell out of there. As the doors pushed open, the lights behind us went out. We turned around, and suddenly the dining room was just as old and abandoned looking as the outside. The people were gone, the music was gone, and everything was covered in dust. Being out of that room made me feel a little more like myself. We took the stairs this time on our way down, and discovered that the lobby was also looking in pretty rough shape. The difference from what it looked like earlier was night and day. I wouldn't believe my eyes had Aaron not been there to experience everything that I was. I took my phone out one more time and snapped some more pictures. An uneasy feeling swept over me, and I knew it was time to leave. We bustled on out of there and something felt off, like we had been in there for a long time, but I knew that was impossible. Aaron and I looked at the eerie yet mysterious hotel one last time, before making our way back to the car. In the distance, we could see Mom and Dad frantically looking around for something. What's going on with those two? Aaron asked. Mom, Dad, I called out. They started running to us. Mom was sobbing and Dad was panicked. Mom couldn't get a word out because she was crying so badly. I'll never forget the sheer panic in Dad's voice when he yelled, "Where the hell have you two been? Your mother and I were worried sick." Aaron and I were startled. I looked over at the picnic that Mom had so lovingly put out for us and noticed that the fresh fruit didn't look so fresh anymore. The cream on the strawberry tarts had lost its shape and spilled over the sides. The salad looked dry and withered. I checked the time on my phone. It was 8:32 p.m. Aaron, look. I showed him the screen. I felt sick. We couldn't possibly have been gone for more than half an hour. I couldn't even hear the yelling anymore. I was so dizzy I thought I was going to pass out. It took a good few minutes before I could even think straight. Mom and Dad started getting in the car, and I begged and pleaded for them to listen. Aaron and I tried telling them about the hotel, but Dad said that he didn't know what we were talking about. I pointed in the direction of the hotel, but I couldn't see it anymore. Then I tried showing him the pictures I took on my phone, but they were gone too. All of the evidence just vanished. Aaron went pale. I felt like I was losing my mind. I think at some point Dad must have finally heard the desperation in our voices. He gave us a hug and Mom kissed our cheeks, still crying. We got in the car and no one said a single word for the whole ride back. My parents put the land up for sale almost right after we got home. They have just been given an offer. I thought moving to the country would be a good thing. Less stress, fewer problems, less crime. But I don't feel safe out here. Not now. Being isolated feels like a mistake. A huge, massive mistake. I thought I would love it. All the peace and quiet. And I did. Except now my husband isn't. Well, he doesn't seem like himself. And I'm completely cut off from everyone. We bought this farm site unseen during COVID. We were those people. 5 acres of prime Midwest farmland. Flat, open, and hot, with topsoil 12 inches deep. Perfect for a little homestead. There was a quaint farmhouse to boot, with a front porch perfect for rocking chairs. My mom thought we were crazy. I don't know why you want to be so far from us. She spat at me one day as we boxed things up at our old house. Darren knows what he's doing. We're going to be fine. You don't know anything about farming. You won't last a week. But she was wrong. We'd set out a huge garden, bought some chickens, and settled into our new community. And unlike many of the sight unseen home purchase horror stories you hear about, our farmhouse, while small, was darling in person. Everything had been going great. Until last night. I was reading in bed when Darren suddenly sat up. I think I left the back gate open. Oh really? Yeah. He got out of bed and slipped on some shoes. I'm gonna go check. I kept reading, and I guess I lost track of time. When I looked at the clock, almost 20 minutes had passed. He should have been back already. I marked my page and got up. I peeked out the window but couldn't see anything. I cursed Darren under my breath for not installing the motion sensor light over our garage barn. It was pitch black out there. That's one thing they don't tell you about living in the country. The nights are dark, pitch black, and the only light around is your own and the stars. Grumbling, I slipped on my rubber boots by the back door and turned on the porch light. He'd probably just gotten off track looking at all the stuff we needed to fix. There was plenty of that around. I slipped outside. The cool summer air smelled of cut hay and buzzed with insects, and my boots crunched on the loose gravel. I thought for sure he would be in the barn, but he wasn't. The lights were off in there too. That's when I noticed a soft light coming from our front field, right behind the barn. I walked to the edge of the building for a better look. When I turned the corner, light blasted my face, so bright I had to shield my eyes with my hand. Confused, I tried to blink them open. What I saw made me recoil. I stepped back into the shadows, my heart pounding. A bead of sweat ran down my forehead, and I wiped it away with a finger. I know what I saw. It was a spaceship, and it was illuminating Darren, who stood frozen in the pasture. I crept to the corner, crouched and shaking. I peeked again. There was a spaceship. Darren was now floating skyward, illuminated by a beam of incredible light. Oh God, I choked out. A sob escaped my lips. I hate to admit it, I wasn't brave. I didn't try to help him. Instead, I turned on my heels and ran back to the house as fast as I could. I flew into the house and bolted the door behind me. I slid down to the floor and prayed they hadn't seen me. I didn't know what to do. There was no one to call, and what would I even say? I numbly sat there until I fell into a restless sleep. But this morning I woke up to Darren frying eggs in the kitchen. My first thought was, how did he get in here? But then I remembered. The front door. It wasn't locked. No one locks their door out here. Why would you? I stared at him. Honey, I asked tentatively, are you feeling all right? He plated the eggs and brought them to the table. Sure, why? You never came to bed last night. He laughed. Sure I did. You were out cold, still holding that book with the light on. I felt a surge of relief. Oh really? Then I felt doubtful. How did I get down here? I think you were sleepwalking again. Oh. I stared down at my plate. 2 fried eggs and a slice of bacon grinned back at me like a demented smiley face. Darren had fried the eggs. Not scrambled them like I always did. He knew I hated fried eggs. Especially the runny ones. Something was off. I ate the eggs anyway, and didn't call attention to his mistake. The rich buttery yolks turned my stomach. I carefully watched Darren as he cleaned his plate. Surely all that last night was just a dream. Right? Had to be. Maybe I'm having stress nightmares again. I have this bad feeling something is wrong with him. I just peeked out the window, and right now he's out in the barn. I don't know what he's doing. If something is wrong, that means it wasn't a dream. Maybe that's not my husband at all. I really wanted to believe that nothing happened, that I imagined everything. But Darren just kept getting weirder and weirder. Which means he really was sucked up by a spaceship. First thing after breakfast, he went outside to the barn. I was washing dishes in the sink when I glanced up and saw him on the tractor tilling up the front field. My mouth flopped open. I'd been planning to use that area for a you-pick strawberry operation. I'd even ordered the plastic sheeting and supplies last week online. I abandoned the sink full of suds and dishes and marched outside. "What are you doing?" I yelled into the roar of the engine. I know he saw me, but he didn't stop. I finally turned and went back inside. I had a bad feeling. All day long he worked the field. I watched him cautiously from inside the house. When I saw him finally head towards the barn in the afternoon, I thought he was done. I was wrong. He emerged a bit later with an ancient planter hitched to the back. I didn't know the thing even worked. It had been left here by the previous owners. "What the hell?" I muttered, and I stormed back outside. "Darren, what's going on?" I screamed as the tractor passed by. He did stop at this time, and I ran over as the tractor idled. "What are you doing?" I thought this was where we would plant the strawberries. I pleaded. His face was sheet white, and beads of sweat ran down his forehead. His expression was blank. "I'm planting corn," he stated. He leaned closer. "We can only plant corn." A chill ran down my spine. The way he said it felt like a threat. He put the tractor in gear and moved on as I stepped back. "It's too late to plant corn this year." I yelled at his retreating backside. He didn't acknowledge this, and I withdrew to the house to watch and wait. Darren stayed out in the field for the rest of the day. He didn't take breaks or come in to eat or drink. He had to be dehydrated. It was well over 90, and I knew he was hungry. It wasn't normal. Darren didn't turn the tractor off until nearly 9 o'clock. I prepared a meal for us. When he came in, I didn't mention the strawberry field. In fact, I didn't say much at all. Darren was scaring me, and I didn't want to let on. He looked rough, almost feverish, and his eyes looked straight through me. We sat in our rocking chairs on the front porch as we ate dinner. It was dusk and the lightning bugs were out. "I made you some brownies," I said, passing him the plate. He took one without comment and bit a corner off. I watched him carefully over my glass of iced tea. He leaned his head back and closed his eyes. His rocking slowed to a stop. "Darren," I said. He didn't answer. "Darren," I said louder. He didn't stir. Sure, good, it was working. I'd made some special brownies just for Darren, laced with several of my crushed-up Ambien. I'd never drugged anyone before, so I prayed they were strong enough to keep him asleep for a while. I went inside and quietly turned the deadbolt on the front door. I dropped my plate in the sink and slinked out the back to the barn. I had to get those tractor keys just to keep him from doing any more damage or possibly hurting himself in exhaustion. They were dangling in the ignition where I suspected they would be. I pocketed the keys and turned to leave. That's when I spotted the bags of corn seeds. There was a big one full of regular seed coated with red fungicide powder. That bag had been here since we moved in, but beside it was something else. My hand trembled as I opened the sack. The corn seed inside was glowing a faint silvery blue. I dropped the burlap. Crap. The aliens had been real. They had really abducted Darren, and now he was growing glowing corn for them. I inspected the planter. He must have mixed the glowing corn with normal corn. Darren had contaminated the front field with glowing, radioactive, my brain speculated, corn seed. My heart pounded. All of a sudden, I just wanted to be safely in bed and away from all this. I turned and headed back in the house. I locked the back door and breathed deeply. I knew logically the house was little protection against whatever I was up against. It was, however, excellent protection against Darren. I had a pang of regret. What had I done? "Well, you had to," my brain answered. His behavior was off. He had worked himself to exhaustion, and he was ruining my farm plans with his delusions. Still, I felt guilty for leaving him on the porch all night. I crept to the front window and lifted a curtain. Darren was gone. My mind raced as I lay in bed, covers pulled up to my chin. Why were the aliens making Darren grow corn? Was their plan for the corn to mix with all the regular corn and be shipped out across America, tainting our food supply, or perhaps turning us into zombie slaves? Why us? Were we chosen because our little farm wasn't growing corn like everyone else? Is everyone else in on this? Are they growing glowing corn too? My mind reeled at the implications. And then, of course, my husband was not himself. May never be himself again. He was working for them now. I had completely lost him. And then, was he a threat? Would he actually hurt me, his wife? Most importantly, where was he? I felt guilty for locking him out of the house. But I knew that Darren wasn't the real Darren. Couldn't be. It was hard going to sleep. My world had been turned upside down, and I had no idea what my next steps would be. Unfortunately for me, I wasn't aware of my next steps at all. I was standing outside in the tall grass when I woke up, wearing nothing but a giant t-shirt. It was early morning, and the grass was still wet with dew. I'd sleepwalked, and I'd left the back door wide open for who knows how long. Damn, I whispered. I was in trouble. I had no phone, no weapons, no keys, no shoes. Just then, the door slammed. I looked back. Darren was standing in the doorway of the house, about 50 yards off. He looked awful. If he had been pale yesterday, today he was snow white. Dark rings encircled his eyes, and his hair looked matted. I ran. He followed. I fled to the barn, where I had some old rubber boots. I slipped them on. I had a terrible understanding that I had to get away from him, that I was in danger, that he was coming to kill me. I ran to the back of the barn, boots flapping. The door was padlocked. I heard the tractor engine blast to life. I whirled around. There he was on the tractor, on the other end of the barn alley. The side pins were shut. I was trapped. Wildly, I searched for a way out. There was a ladder in the middle of the alley leading to the loft. Maybe I could climb up and then jump down at the entrance behind the tractor. I bolted towards it, just as the tractor advanced. I prayed to whoever was listening that I could make it before he ran over me or crushed me with the bucket. And I did, with seconds to spare. I leapt onto the ladder, scrambling with a speed I had no clue I possessed. Our eyes locked just as he overshot, and the pure hatred there confirmed I was in danger. I quickly ran over the rickety planks of the loft and jumped down at the barn entrance. I was out of there before he could put it in reverse. I shot out into the open, my boots slipping in the wet grass. I looked around frantically. There was nowhere to hide, just our few buildings surrounded by open land. I took off running towards the tool shed. We weren't people that kept guns around, so I hoped there was something in there, anything that I could use to protect me from my alien husband. I whipped the door open. The air was musty and stale, and the room was cluttered with tools. I frantically searched the shelves, my hands shaking. Then I saw it. The chainsaw. I'd never used anything like it before. I actually hate power tools, mostly because I think spinning blades are a bad idea. Okay, I whispered. Breathe. I knew it needed gas, but which one? There were 2 bottles on the shelf. Didn't it need some sort of special oil gas? I grabbed one of the canisters, hoping it was the right gas for this thing, and poured it into the tank. I was so nervous I spilled half of it on the ground. I was interrupted by Darren charging into the shed with the tractor. The noise of the boards tearing and metal tools crashing was deafening. Something heavy fell and gashed my forehead. I was stunned. I couldn't believe he was this stupid. He was trying, unsuccessfully, to back up and ram the building again, but the tractor was hung in the debris, which meant he was now getting down and coming towards me. Frantically, I reached for the chainsaw. It had been turned over and gas glugged out onto the floor. I silently prayed it was enough to start the thing. I screwed the cap on and pumped the primer. I ripped the cord. Nothing happened. Darren was off the tractor. He looked worse than ever. He was soaked with clammy sweat, and I could see clumps of hair had fallen out. His eyes gleamed silver, and I knew there was no trace of him in there, that it wasn't Darren at all. I turned my full attention to the chainsaw and began ripping the cord as hard as I could. Crap! I screamed, shaking the chainsaw. That's when I saw it, the kill switch. I flipped it, ripped the cord, and the chainsaw sputtered to life. I stood up and whirled the saw at Darren. It was heavier than I expected, and the blade swung low, but I still managed to slice his upper thigh. Thick, silvery liquid sprayed out of the leg, coating us both. He slumped down to one knee. I swung the saw back at him again. It's not him, it's not him, it's not him, my brain chanted. The blades connected with his neck, and his head flopped to the side, still connected by a string of flesh. Silvery, mercury-like liquid blasted out of the wound and sprayed everything around us. I screamed at what I had done in this surreal situation. I dropped the chainsaw and ran out of the ruined tool shed. Blood dripped down my face and mixed with the silver liquid, covering my body in a sticky gray slime. I ran to our empty house, adrenaline pumping. It was completely silent. I found my cell phone laying on the table. I picked it up and dialed my mother. Mom, I said with forced calm, you were right, Darren does not know what he's doing. I talked to her for a long while, but no matter what she says, I've decided to stay. This is my home now. I'll start on the cleanup tomorrow. And as for the corn, I noticed my neighbor has a big sprayer. I'm hoping Roundup will eliminate it. People always talk about the number of monsters that reside in our country's vast tracts of uninhabitable land, the dense forests, deep caves, and the remote mountaintops, and the danger these creatures present to us. They're right to warn you, especially about the areas around our national parks. But did you ever stop to think about why the vast majority of people that go missing are last seen in some of our largest cities? For every one person that goes missing in the American wilderness, 3 vanish in our cities. Granted, some of these disappearances on both sides can be contributed to murders, accidents, kidnappings, or runaways, but a growing number each year can be contributed to those things that live in the shadows. And it's getting worse, especially in our cities. Ask any homeless person on the street. They'll tell you. 99.99% of the people they tell will write them off as crazy or under the influence. But I promise you they aren't lying. They saw a huge, sticky tongue latch onto a woman and pull her into a dumpster. So have I. They saw a little girl lure a man into an alleyway before pulling his arm off and lapping up the puddle of crimson. Not crazy. I've seen that too. A living shadow that envelopes its victims in a suffocating black slime. I haven't seen that one, but I know a guy who did, and I believe him. These things are all around us, and you'll do well to listen to my story and take heed. This could save your life. A girl had gone missing. Young, blonde, blue eyes. The kind that gets her face all over the news when they go missing. Her name was Amelia Marr. I'm sure the entire city had her name and face memorized by the time my story started. Seems like it was all they played on the news for a week. About a week after Amelia's disappearance, I was walking home from the bars drunk and cursing myself for not being able to close with the girl I was talking to when a voice called out to me. Normally I wouldn't have paid any attention. Not too many people you want to hang out with are on the streets after 2 a.m. But this was a woman's voice. Being the young guy that I was at the time, I came to a screeching halt and turned in the direction the voice called from. The voice originated from a dark shadow beneath a highway overpass bridge. "Hello," I called into the darkness, my eyes straining to pick up and shapes moving around in the inky black. "Can you help me?" The voice called back from somewhere in the darkness. "I think I'm lost." Something about the voice was strange. The cadence was slightly off, like whoever was speaking was reading lines and didn't fully understand what they were saying. It reminded me of students reciting lines in Spanish class back in school. I still couldn't pinpoint where exactly the voice was coming from as it reverberated between the buildings and the overpass above. "Where are you?" I said to the darkness still standing just outside the shadow of the overpass. "I can't see you." I heard movement from within the shadow, not footsteps but something dragging along the ground. "I'm here," the darkness said. "Closer now." I fixed my eyes on the source of the voice, and as my eyes adjusted, a figure came into focus. Just faintly through the darkness, I could make out a dirty white sundress. The ethereal glow of the fabric created a stark contrast against the darkness that enveloped her and made her facial features that much harder to see. "I still can't see you." I strained my eyes, squinting into the dark. "Come out into the light." I watched the outline of the sundress move. It seemed to glide through the air slowly. I heard no footsteps, and I didn't hear the dragging noise either. It came to a stop about 4 feet from its original position, still sequestered well within the shadow, but I could now see a little more. In the dim light, I could see the blonde hair and blue eyes of Amelia Marr. She was bruised and scabs dotted her face, arms, and legs. A look of crazed terror filled her eyes, like she was trying with all of her willpower to scream, but she couldn't. "Amelia?" I asked, sobering up quickly. "Are you Amelia?" I took a step towards her. "Please help me," Amelia said, as she abruptly reached a hand out in my direction. I took a step back this time. Something wasn't right about her. The extending of her hand was too jerky and choreographed, and her mouth when she spoke was downright unnatural. Her jaw moved up and down in a chomping motion, but her lips never moved. It was like watching a dubbed-over foreign film. Nothing about this situation felt right at all, but I had to do something. This was Amelia Marr, the girl who had been all over the news for the last 5 days. I recognized her right away. I couldn't just leave her there. I had seen her family on television crying. I took another step towards her and reached my hand into the shadow to grab onto her extended hand, when suddenly a car drove by. The headlights illuminated her for half a second, just as I was about to grab her. She wasn't standing, her bare feet hung pointed to the ground, her chipped toenails dragging along the cement. She had fine, barely perceptible threads intricately wrapped around her joints, her knees, wrists, elbows, and shoulders. A few other fine, silky threads were attached on both sides of her jaw and both sides of her head. Her eyes were screaming at me. I've never in my life seen anyone look so helpless. In that half-second of light, my eyes followed the thin strands of silk that attached to her joints to their origin on the ceiling the overpass made above us. Barely visible, a giant, hulking spider pressed up against the overpass. Each of its 8 legs were manipulated by a strand of silk controlling their marionette below. I took 2 steps back out of the shadow, staring at the massive creature. I watched it twitch its legs, and my eyes darted back down to Amelia as she was dragged back into the darkness under the bridge to be used as bait for the next guy unlucky enough to walk in this direction. I left her there, and I ran straight home. Amelia Mara was never seen again. I've seen a lot of weird shit in this city over the years, and stuff like that seems to be happening more and more often. I said all of this to say, don't think you have to be out in the countryside to run into a monster. They're everywhere. Sometimes they even look just like you and me. You probably walk by a few of them every week without knowing. So, keep your head on your shoulders and don't do anything stupid unless you want to spend your last few days being used as bait like Amelia, or maybe even worse. June 15th, 2021, during my first week at Outpost Aurora, I faced an unsettling cycle of sleepless nights and ceaseless days. This was a result of the unyielding Arctic sun that refused to set during the Alaskan summer. It was challenging to acclimate to my tiny quarters, forcing myself to rely on the blackout blinds and my wristwatch to keep track of time instead of the ever-present sun. I had willingly traded the relative normalcy of Anchorage's 19-hour summer days for this endless disorientation, all in pursuit of my doctoral field research on the impacts of climate change on remote Inuit communities. Outpost Aurora, a climate research facility, accommodated around 30 inhabitants, a diverse group of scientists, researchers, and a handful of maintenance and support staff. As an anthropologist, I was somewhat of an oddity among the geologists, climatologists, and biologists who dominated the research team. We got along well enough, but there was a clear professional disconnect. Their world revolved around weather data, rocks, and polar flora and fauna, while mine centered around the stories and experiences of indigenous people. Being the only Inuit-speaking researcher in this remote expanse of northern Alaska, I felt a profound obligation to chronicle and protect the rich oral traditions of the local communities before they were lost to the shifting snow and ice. I felt like I was straddling a fault line. I was the sole link between these isolated villages and the outside world. On this particular evening, I'm engrossed in transcribing my interview with Katak, an elderly self-proclaimed shaman boasting about harpooning a seal the size of a walrus, when a soft, slightly raspy voice broke my concentration. Dr. Kalik, looking up from my work, I met the gaze of a young woman at the far end of my table. Her face was brightened by a warm smile. Her luminous blue eyes shimmered with an indescribable intensity, and a tangle of chestnut hair escaped from under her woolen beanie. "I'm sorry," I replied, removing my headphones. "You're Dr. Noah Kalik, right?" She repeated. "Well, technically I'm still a PhD candidate," I sheepishly clarified. "My apologies, PhD candidate Noah Kalik," she said, her tone dancing on the line of playfulness and sarcasm. "I'm field technician Rebecca McKenzie, but you can call me Becca." Her joke garnered a genuine chuckle from me. "And you can call me Noah," I said, extending my hand. She shook my hand. "Taiku," she exclaimed, clearly pronouncing the Inuit word for welcome. Intrigued, I asked, "You speak Inuit?" "Just that and my mumika," she admitted, shrugging. Struggling to contain my laughter, I corrected her. Becca, you just said you're a muskox." Her cheeks turned a bright shade of red. "The village children told me it meant nice to meet you," she mumbled. "I hope you didn't say that to a lot of people," I chuckled. "Just to about a half-dozen villagers." And to the site director, she admitted, her face paling in realization. "You said that to Dr. Anderson?" I asked, aghast. "Oh dear. Yeah, but I don't think she knew what it meant either," Becca responded, which brought me to fits of laughter in which she soon joined. "Anyway, Noah," she started as she pulled up a chair and sat across from me. "I saw your name on the roster for tomorrow's ice course sampling trip. It's your first one, isn't it?" "Yeah," I said, the word stuck in my throat as I pictured the steep, ice-covered mountain range I had agreed to climb. "You don't climb much, I'm guessing?" she asked. "I've done a fair bit of hiking and mountain climbing, but nothing on this scale," I confessed. "I'm Inuit. We mostly stick to the lowland coast." Peering out the window, my gaze fell on the towering peaks dominating the horizon. The mountain we were to ascend was known to the locals as the Den of the Dead, an ominous title for anything, let alone a treacherous peak covered in ancient shifting glaciers. The name was part of an old Inuit legend, one of the many tales I had collected from the village elders. The story painted a picture of vengeful spirits purportedly inhabiting these glaciers, ready to wreak havoc on anyone audacious enough to disrupt their icy abode. While I didn't believe in spirits, the hazardous crevasses and unpredictable weather that awaited us felt like wrathful spirits in their own right. Becca could sense my apprehension. "It's all right to be nervous, but don't worry. Dr. Anderson wouldn't send you out on your own. You've been placed in good hands." "Whose hands, exactly?" I asked skeptically. Her grin widened. "Mine, actually." Raising an eyebrow, I wasn't sure whether to feel comforted or more concerned. "Yours?" "What? Don't look at me like that," Becca protested playfully. "I've got plenty of experience." "No offense, Becca, but you look like you just stepped out of an undergrad class," I told her. She laughed at my comment, but I noticed the pride in her eyes. Looks can be deceiving. I've navigated those passes dozens of times. I can handle both of us. "So what's it like being up there in the glaciers?" I asked. "It's an incredible experience. When you hold an ice core in your hands, it's like you're touching history, feeling the Earth's past in your palms," she explained. "Well, when you put it that way," I said, finding her description oddly relatable. "I'm almost looking forward to it." "That's the spirit," she exclaimed, clapping me on the back. Her laughter echoed through the mess hall, cutting through the tension that had settled there. June 16th, 2021. The morning was a whirlwind of activity. By 5 a.m., the common area was already bustling. Our departure from the base was anything but a silent affair. Instead, it was a cacophony of barking huskies and buzzing chatter, filled with last-minute discussions about the plan and route. Our team of 6, clad in heavy winter gear, was busy loading equipment onto the dog sleds. The sun glared in the cloudless sky, its blinding light reflecting off the snow and ice, making it seem as if we were about to journey across a white, unending desert. The air was palpable with a strange blend of excitement, anxiety, and a touch of the unknown. As I loaded my pack onto a sled, Becca approached. Dressed in snow pants and a parka, her face framed by a fur-trimmed hood, she resembled an Arctic explorer from a bygone era. She methodically inspected the gear I had packed to ensure everything was present and in working order. Leaning in, she imparted some final words of advice. "Keep close, stay focused, and remember it's not a race. The goal is to get there and back safely." Drawing confidence from her words, I nodded. As we began the journey, there was an eerie calm, the hustle and bustle of the camp fading into the vast, icy expanse. The first few hours of our trek were uneventful, the terrain mostly flat. Each sled accommodated 2 people, with Becca and I paired together. While the sled dogs forged ahead, we passed the time making small talk and trading stories about life back at Outpost Aurora. I told her about my disconnect with my colleagues. Becca said she understood, confessing to me that she was much lower on the pecking order than her confident demeanor the previous night might have suggested, which explained why she was assigned the task of looking after the new guy. Despite the teasing tone, there was a hint of relief in her voice, an appreciation for having someone to talk to during these long, perilous excursions. As the day progressed, the snow-swept landscape morphed into steep, rocky inclines. The dogs pulled valiantly, their breath fogging in the chill air. A torrent of awe and anxiety warred within me as I surveyed the brutally beautiful landscape around us. I was reminded of the tales from my grandmother's childhood, how the indomitable Inuit people had traversed a polar wasteland spanning a greater distance than New York to Los Angeles, and yet managed to carve out a life for themselves. I felt as though I were walking in the footsteps of my ancestors. Arriving at the foot of the mountain, the daunting process of setting up the drills unfolded. These colossal machines, disassembled and transported on sleds, had to be carefully put together again in these unforgiving conditions. The team had the monumental task of drilling a mile into the mountainside to reach ice that hadn't been disturbed in hundreds of thousands of years. Each layer of ice was a snapshot of the Earth's climate at that point in time, capturing tiny bubbles of air, volcanic ash, pollen, dust, and even microscopic life forms. Watching Becca maneuver her way around the equipment, coordinating with the others, it was clear she was in her element. Unlike the rest of the team, my expertise wasn't required for drilling. Instead, I was on a different mission. The rapidly melting glaciers had started uncovering secrets that were long hidden beneath their icy surfaces. Fragments of ancient cultures that had been engulfed by the glaciers over centuries were now resurfacing. It was my job to recover and catalog any artifacts we discovered. As the drilling continued, my eyes were drawn towards a cave not too far from our location. Shielded by an overhanging ledge of ice and snow, it seemed untouched by time. "Becca," I called, catching her attention. I pointed towards the cave. Her eyes followed my pointing finger, and her eyebrows rose slightly. "You want to go in there? Caves are a treasure trove of ancient relics," I explained. As there was a lull in the drilling, she decided to join me in exploring the cave. Upon entering the cave, the first thing I noticed was the cold, which was even more intense than outside. A shiver ran down my spine, not entirely from the temperature. My eyes struggled to adjust to the darkness, the meager light from our flashlights barely illuminating the frozen cavern. I swept my light across the jagged cave floor, searching for any hint of an ancient bonefish hook or an obsidian spearhead. Suddenly, Becca's voice echoed through the cave. "Noah, over here!" My heart skipped a beat as Becca's urgent voice pierced the stillness of the cave. I hurried toward her, my flashlight trembling in my hand. As I approached, I saw her kneeling over what appeared to be a body slumped against the cave wall. My mind spun with questions. Had someone been stranded here recently? Were they in need of help? I attempted to lift the body for a clearer view, but it was frozen in place. "Hey, can you give me a hand?" I asked. Yeah, sure," she replied, with hesitation in her voice. We each took an arm and pulled. The icicles anchoring the body to the cave floor broke with a crack. A gasp caught in my throat as we were greeted by the macabre sight of a woman. Her face was an eerie, porcelain mask lined with intricate blue-black tattoos that curled from her forehead, around her eyes, down to her chin. Her jet-black eye sockets stared back at us, frozen forever in an expression of terror. Her mouth was half open in a silent scream, her teeth sharp and unnaturally white against her frostbitten skin. The light from our flashlights danced across her body, revealing the tiny form huddled in her arms. A child, perfectly preserved in the ice, its body as desiccated as the woman's. The little one's face was a haunting mimicry of its mother's, frozen in time like a delicate porcelain doll. Recoiling in shock, Becca let out a small gasp, covering her mouth with her hand while I sat paralyzed, my mind grappling with the sight before me. I didn't recognize the tattoo patterns on her face, and her clothing didn't match any styles known to the Inuit people. The attire suggested a culture far older than what I was familiar with. My flashlight caught the glint of something metallic. Next to the mother and child was a knife with an ornate handle made of ivory. The blade itself was crudely crafted, like it was beaten into shape with stones, and had a black tint to it. I knew that pre-contact Inuit tribes only had one source of metal for their tools, iron or extracted from meteorites. I think there are more," Becca said, her voice trembling. She pointed deeper into the cave. Slowly, our lights revealed more bodies, each in varying states of preservation. Some were mere skeletons, the ice having worn their flesh away over the centuries, while others were as impeccably preserved as the woman and child. A shared feature among them was the hollow crevices where their eyes used to be. As I shone my flashlight along the icy cave wall, it revealed a sequence of well-preserved cave drawings. They told a disturbing tale of people, similar to the bodies we'd discovered, chased by terrifying, shadowy figures. Their fear echoed the eternal screams on the frozen faces we'd found. The final scenes showed the people in a cave, horrifyingly familiar to our surroundings, with the ominous figures looming over them. A chill ran through my veins that had nothing to do with the frigid temperature. "What do you think happened to them?" Becca asked, sounding like she didn't want to know the answer. "It's difficult to say without a thorough analysis," I rationalized. "Disease? Starvation? Perhaps they were caught in a snowstorm and succumbed to exposure." "Exposure?" she asked. The word alone seemed to have disturbed her more than the bodies themselves. Her naturally light complexion turned a shade paler. Before I could respond, the piercing sound of Becca's radio crackled into life, shattering the quiet stillness of the cave. "Becca, do you copy? This is Dr. Khan. We've got an issue here." The voice of the team lead came through. Becca quickly unclipped the radio, her fingers fumbling in her haste. "This is Becca. We're in the cave. What's wrong?" One of the drills ruptured a gas deposit, releasing some sort of unknown toxic substance. "Get out of there immediately." Dr. Khan's voice held a note of urgency we'd never heard before. Without a moment's hesitation, we scrambled to our feet and bolted towards the entrance of the cave. Even before reaching the mouth of the cave, An intense chemical odor replaced the familiar scent of the tundra. Our husky team was a lifeline in the unforgiving wilderness. Aspen, the fearless leader, blazed the trail ahead. Behind her, Willow and her twin brother, Cedar, mirrored each other in perfect harmony, their connection beyond just their matching silver coats and ice-blue eyes. At the back, Pine, with his unyielding strength, acted as the powerful anchor. As we started our journey, the wind whipped around us, carrying with it the biting chill of the air. The sleds cut through the snow effortlessly, the dogs pulling with an eagerness that defied the unforgiving conditions. "Look, Noah," Becca started, her eyes trained on the horizon. "I want to apologize for what happened back there. I didn't mean to sound so harsh." I looked at her, surprised by the sincerity in her voice. "No, Becca, if anything, I should be thanking you," I admitted, giving her a small, grateful smile. "I'm glad to have a polar expert watching my back," I added, knowing she'd appreciate the compliment. Her cheeks flushed from beneath her protective gear. Whether it was from the cold or my compliment, I couldn't tell. As we ventured farther from our drill site, the landscape underwent subtle, yet unmistakable changes. The sun, perpetually casting a sallow glow, illuminated the pristine snow with an eerie light. The snow no longer glistened. It had a matte, lifeless finish, as if its vitality had been drained. The animals we encountered were behaving unusually too. A snow hare that hopped across our path moved sluggishly, its normally white fur tinged with a sickly, bluish hue. An Arctic fox, usually shy and elusive, showed no fear, no recognition of us as potential threats. It just stared at us with glassy eyes as we passed by, as if it didn't comprehend what it was seeing. The most disconcerting change, however, was the silence. The Arctic is usually filled with sounds, the crunch of snow underfoot, the chattering of birds, the howl of the wind. But now, it was as if nature itself had fallen into a stunned, deathly silence. Even the wind seemed muted, whispering rather than wailing. By the time we reached the village past midnight, the ever-present sun hovered overhead, bathing the icy mountains and vast Arctic ocean in an alien glow. The frigid air gnawed at our faces as we approached the village. Even from the outskirts, I could tell something was wrong. The chimneys of the colorful houses were smokeless. The village, known as Silipinua, or the spirit of the universe, was eerily quiet, a stark contrast to the vibrant community life we had witnessed just days before. Navigating the snow-laden paths between homes, our breath formed small frosty clouds in the freezing air. We called out for any inhabitants, but our voices echoed back, swallowed by the desolate silence. Discarded remnants of everyday life littered our path, children's toys scattered in the snow, piles of half-chopped firewood next to silent homes, and fishing nets abandoned by the river's edge. We entered the largest house, that of the chief and his extended family. The door was ajar, with untouched meals on tables and clothing strewn haphazardly. Inside, we detected a faint, sickly sweet odor, eerily reminiscent of the smell from the drilling site. "Do you think it's the gas?" Becca whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "Must be," I replied, grimacing as the smell hit me again. "But where did everyone go? Maybe they evacuated?" Becca suggested, although she sounded unsure. "I hope so," I said, examining a pot of soup that was still warm. "It doesn't look like they had time to prepare." "Everything's just left," Becca noted, picking up a doll made of walrus ivory. "We need to look for signs," I suggested. "They might have left a message saying where they went." Becca and I systematically searched each house. We reached Kadak's house late in the afternoon. The elderly shaman lived alone in a quaint dwelling on the village outskirts. I had interviewed him only days earlier. As I pushed open the door, the creaking sound echoed ominously. We entered the dimly lit room, the weak sunlight from the window illuminating the dust particles suspended in the air. Everything was just as I remembered, the walls adorned with tribal masks, the aged wooden floor lined with fur rugs, and the hearth at the center, now cold and lifeless. My gaze was drawn to a corner of the room, where a message was hastily etched onto the wall. The text was in the native Inuit syllabary. The normally round characters were inconsistent, as if scrawled in haste. A black-tinted blade, similar to the one I saw in the cave, lay on the floor next to the message. Becca walked up behind me. "What does it say?" My heart pounded in my chest as I translated the text. "It says, 'Beware the spirit of the ice. The Ijarak have returned.'" And then it just cuts off. "What's an Ijarak?" Becca asked, her voice barely above a whisper. I paused, unsure of how much to reveal. "They're spirits from Inuit folklore. They're said to be shapeshifters, creatures that exist, in the realm, between the living and the dead. They're like Inuit boogeymen. My grandma used to tell me that if I didn't behave, an Ijarak would get me in my sleep. Yeah, but that's just a story, right? Becca asked incredulously, like an attempt to explain natural occurrences. A tense silence filled the room. There was more to the myth, but I didn't see any point in scaring her with ghost stories. Tak was always a little eccentric, I said dismissively. He believed in a lot of weird stuff, like saying he could communicate with foxes, and that they would give him messages from the spirit world. I would take everything he says with a grain of salt. A sudden harsh gust of wind rattled the window panes, causing us to exchange a glance of concern. We ran to the window. The first thing I noticed was how dark things had gotten. With the ever-present midnight sun, this should have been impossible. Outside, the sky darkened ominously, the yellow-green hue swallowed by a mass of angry gray clouds. I had goosebumps as the first snowflake landed on the window. The weather forecast hadn't predicted a storm, but there was definitely one brewing. "Storm's coming," Becca said, her eyes wide as she looked out the window. "A big one." I could feel the air around us getting colder. "We need to find shelter," I said, scanning for a good place to hunker down. The gas hadn't affected us yet, and we'd be exposed to more of it if we tried to trudge through the storm with its own inherent dangers. Spotting a large communal building on a hill towards the center of the village, I gestured towards it. "There, that house. It's higher off the ground. We should be safer from the gas there." We gathered the huskies and hurried towards the house, the dogs rushing in ahead of us. The wind howled in our ears, biting through our winter gear as we struggled against the rising storm. Once inside the house, we worked quickly to secure the entrances, sealing the doors and windows with whatever materials we had on hand to minimize the gas exposure. The dogs were restless, pacing anxiously around the room. Their unease mirrored my own. Becca grabbed the radio, her hands shaking slightly as she adjusted the frequency and relayed our situation back to Outpost Aurora. "Dr. Anderson, we're trapped in the village by the storm. We're going to try to wait it out. We're as sealed up as we're going to get against the gas. Over." There was a pause, then her voice crackled through, sounding tense. "Understood. Stay safe. We'll maintain radio contact. Over and out." June 18th, 2021. Becca and I rationed out our meager food supply, cans of stew, chunks of hard bread, and energy bars that tasted like cardboard but had the necessary calories. We melted snow for drinking water, being careful to heat it just enough to kill off any bacteria. Yet, we weren't sure if this method was effective in removing gas. The dogs, our faithful companions, were fed with dry kibble and chunks of frozen fish we had packed. As the wind outside roared and battered the structure of the house, we huddled close together around a portable heater for warmth. Even with our winter gear on, the biting cold was almost unbearable. The dogs lay in a pile, their bodies a source of warmth in the otherwise freezing room. Unable to sleep, my mind was restless, filled with the day's chaotic events. I could still picture Erica, her body convulsing as the toxic gas took hold. The image filled me with a dread I could hardly put into words. How long before we too would begin to show symptoms? Ever so often, I found myself glancing over at Becca, scrutinizing her face for any signs of illness. I sat up and pulled out the knife I had taken from Katak's home, examining it under the faint light in the room. The black-tinted blade was forged meteorite iron, the same as the one we found at the drilling site. The handle was made of narwhal tusk, intricately carved with ancient Inuit symbols. As I traced them with my fingers, memories of the legends about the Ijarak swirled in my mind. These weren't just children's tales. The Inuit people respected and feared these spirits. While I respected the myths and legends, I was still a man of science, grounded in reality and observable facts. Yet to dismiss these tales as mere superstition seemed almost disrespectful. Exhaling slowly, I glanced once more at Becca. Her breaths were steady and slow, a stark contrast to the raging storm outside. A wave of relief washed over me. She was fine, at least for now. Carefully, I put the blade back into my pocket and tried to settle back into my sleeping bag. I don't recall when I fell asleep, but the dream was vivid. I was a child again, back in the tiny, cramped apartment in Anchorage's Mountain View neighborhood that I shared with my mom and grandma. The faint smell of my mom's cooking clung to the worn-out furniture. I could hear the muffled sound of sirens and angry voices from the street below, a soundtrack to my childhood. I was bundled under the patchwork quilt my grandma made, trying to stay awake until my mom got home from her 2 jobs. My eyelids were heavy, sleep was creeping in, but I fought against it. I wanted to catch a glimpse of my mom, to reassure myself that she had made it back safely. Beside me, my grandmother sat in her favorite rocking chair, the rhythmic creaking a soothing counterpoint. Her voice was soft, yet firm, as she wove intricate stories of ancient Inuit legends, her wrinkled hands gesturing dramatically, enhancing the narrative. Suddenly, a loud banging noise echoed through the small apartment. Fear gripped me as she looked at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of terror and determination. "Noah, you're in danger. You need to leave now," she said, her voice filled with urgency. She hurriedly pulled a parka over my small frame, her movements quick and precise. The banging grew louder, the whole apartment shaking with the sheer force of it. I recognized the noise instantly, the sound of my father's rage. The door burst open, splintering into pieces as a drunken figure staggered into the room. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched my father's slurred movements, his eyes scanning the room. Ignoring him, my grandmother ushered me towards the window that opened onto the fire escape. "Go to Mrs. Olson's place, and I'll come get you later," she instructed, her voice just a whisper now, but her words held the weight of an ultimatum. "But Grandma," I started, but she cut me off. "No buts, Noah, go." I was just about to climb out of the window when I glanced back one last time, my heart aching at the sight of my grandmother, her frail form standing tall and defiant against my drunken father. "Where is he, Inuri? Where's my son?" He slurred, his gaze wild. "You're drunk, Hank," Grandma said. "Sober up, and then maybe we'll talk." "He's my son," my dad shouted. "You can't keep him from me." I heard a scuffle ensuing. "Get out of my way," my dad screamed. As the cold air hit my face, my dream began to unravel, the harsh reality of my past merging into the grim predicament of my present. I was jolted awake, my heart pounding, the sound growling and barking. I shot up from my sleeping bag. Becca was already awake and trying to calm the dogs. "Hey guys, what's wrong?" she asked, checking on each one. "What's the matter?" I asked groggily. "I don't know, something must have spooked them," she responded. Becca reached for the radio, pressing the button and calling through the static. "Drill team, this is Becca and Noah. Do you copy?" Only the hum of the storm responded to our call. "Dr. Khan, are you there? Please respond." Her voice wavered slightly, a hint of fear creeping into her normally confident tone. Still, there was no answer. The silence seemed to amplify the harsh howling of the wind outside, the sound seeming to seep into the very walls of the house. With a worried expression, she put down the radio. "We need to try again in a bit. The storm might be affecting the signal." The dogs were growing more restless by the minute, their whimpers growing into anxious barks. They were fixated at something just outside the front door. Sensing their distress, I got up and peered through the tiny crack in the door. Among the swirling gusts of snow, I saw unsettling figures moving. Their forms were hauntingly unfamiliar, a blend of the grotesque and beautiful. Some had elongated limbs and disproportionate body parts, their shapes hardly human. Others were adorned with animal characteristics, antlers that cut through the gale, feathers that fluttered in the blizzard, scales that shimmered in the harsh Arctic lights, or fur that rippled as if in a breeze. "Becca," I whispered, my throat dry. "You need to see this." I didn't get a response. "Becca, did you hear me?" I whispered a little louder. A blood-curdling scream tore through the night. "Becca," my heart lurched in my chest as I turned. One of the creatures was crawling on the ceiling and walls of the cabin, its elongated limbs ending in claws scraped against the wood, creating the sound of nails on chalkboard. Its body was like smoke, twisting and changing, never settling on a single form. Without warning, the being slid down from the walls, making no noise as it landed. Its form was ghostly, constantly shifting in the light of our lantern. One moment it resembled an Inuit woman with straight black hair, the next a polar bear with gleaming fangs. It shimmered as if formed from ice and snow, a mirage born of the Arctic itself. Its eyes, the only constant in its ever-changing form, two jet-black sockets, empty and soulless, stared at us. Becca just stood there, stunned. I grabbed her hand and pulled her close. "Get behind me," I whispered. The thing's mouth opened wide, emitting a guttural sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It started mimicking Dr. Khan's voice perfectly. "I don't understand what's happening. It's the gas. We're changing." Erica's voice followed, panicked and gasping for breath. "I can feel it inside me. It's burning." The shrieks of pain and terror were lifelike, making it all the more chilling. Next came the voices of the others on the team, their pleas for help, their cries of agony echoing in the otherwise silent room. The entity's body contorted and twisted, as if in a grotesque imitation of their final, torturous moments. It was as if the very air around us carried the terror of those last moments. The last voice we heard was Dr. Khan's. "Please help us." The creature looked at us, its eyes vacant and unblinking. Then it tilted its head and began to laugh, a terrible, echoing sound that filled the room. Its laughter was like nothing I'd ever heard, a horrifying imitation of human joy. June 19th, 2021. The entity's laughter faded as it began to pace around the room, slowly, deliberately, like a wild animal sizing up its territory. It moved with a disjointed grace, limbs twisting and contorting independently. Yet its gaze, filled with a primal and animalistic intelligence, never strayed from us. An eerie sense of foreboding settled over me as I stared into the depths of its eyes. Becca looked stunned. "It has their voices," she murmured, her voice echoing horror. "How can it have their voices?" I was too shocked to respond, grappling with the surreal reality of a creature physically before me. It felt like discovering the monster under my bed was real after all. Before eyes was an eerie. The huskies suddenly lunged forward, their growls escalating into feral snarls in a brave attempt to protect us. Their bravery snapped me out of my shock. The creature jerked its head towards the dogs, its form morphing into a giant wolf, mouth gaping, sharp fangs glistening. "No!" I yelled out. Instinctively, I reached into my pocket and pulled out the knife I'd picked up at Kadak's home. The blade was cool to the touch, the intricate symbols carved into the handle pressing into my palm. The room was still for a moment as the entity stared at me. Behind me, I could hear Becca's soft footsteps, her breaths drawn in quiet, controlled patterns. She was inching toward her pack, painstakingly slow to avoid drawing attention. The floorboards creaked under her weight. My heart pounded in my chest, every thump echoing through my body, a constant reminder of the danger we were in. Regardless, I remained rooted to the spot, my eyes locked on the Ijarak. Its form continued to shift, solidifying into something more threatening. It resembled a fearsome beast now, more bare than human, the antlers of a caribou replacing the straight black hair. It seemed to be preparing itself for a confrontation. Becca reached her pack, her movements almost soundless. She rummaged inside for a brief moment before her fingers closed around the stock of her Seiko 85, a rugged bolt-action rifle she had packed as protection against polar bears. The Ijarak was becoming increasingly agitated. Its form started convulsing, as if it was trying to contain an inner tempest. Its movements became more violent, the antlers slamming against the wooden beams, a gruesome display of power and aggression. Becca was now on her feet, rifle in hand. She moved swiftly and deftly, her eyes burning with cold determination, as though the dying cries of her colleagues had ignited a fury within her. As the creature turned towards her, she fired at it point blank, the sound of the shot ringing through the cabin. The bullet tore through its nebulous form, ripping a solid chunk of flesh from the transient layer of smoke and ice. A gut-wrenching howl filled the room. The Ijarak recoiled, its form flickering wildly between various shapes, human, animal, monster, each more horrifying than the last. Its body was writhing and shifting more wildly than ever. As it staggered back, a viscous, dark fluid began to ooze from its wound. The smell was overpowering, far worse than the gas. It was a nauseating mixture of sulfur and rot, a stench so potent that it made my eyes water and my stomach churn. As the creature writhed in pain, its haunting howls transformed into the anguished cries. In its agony, it went into a frenzy, thrashing around the room, its form undulating and changing rapidly. Becca worked quickly to chamber another round, but the creature's frenzied movements made it difficult to get a clear shot. As she lined up her aim, the creature lunged towards her, its claws outstretched and its eyes fixed on her. "Becca, watch out!" I shouted. Acting on instinct, I pushed her out of the way. We both tumbled to the ground as the creature's claws sliced into my parka, narrowly missing my skin. Its momentum carried it into the wall of the cabin. The impact shook the entire cabin, dislodging several wooden planks from the wall. The Ijarak howled in frustration and pain, shards of wood protruding from its body. "Go!" I urged Becca. "Get the dogs and get out now." She nodded, scrambling towards the dogs who were barking and whining in distress. Becca hurriedly gathered them, leading them toward the door. I turned back to face the entity. Its form was slowly solidifying, and its blackened eyes were fixed on me. Fueled by a surge of adrenaline, I grabbed a portable kerosene heater nearby. It was a hefty device, radiating a comforting warmth that felt out of place in this nightmarish situation. I hoisted it, feeling the fuel sloshing inside. Noah, we gotta go now, Becca shouted from the door. I waited for a split second, watching as the Ajarak began to approach. As it charged at me, I hurled the heater with all the force I could muster. The kerosene heater spiraled through the air, colliding with the creature. The cabin was instantly bathed in the terrifying light of a fireball. The entity let out a horrifying shriek that echoed through the cabin. I bolted towards the sled without a second glance. As Becca and I made our escape, the fire quickly spread to the nearby wooden structures, turning the village into an inferno. Our sled slid smoothly over the icy terrain, pushed by the hardy dogs, carrying us farther and farther from the village. The roaring wind cut through us, and the snow, stirred into a whirlwind by the storm, reduced visibility to near zero. As we moved further away, the light from the raging fire grew fainter, swallowed by the unrelenting white. We continued on. In the general direction, our primary concern was putting distance between us and the creature, rather than reaching our destination. With the light fading behind us and the storm intensifying, we knew we needed to find shelter soon. We were in the heart of the tundra, a vast, flat, treeless plain. Seeking refuge in this desolate expanse was no simple task, but we were fortunate enough to stumble upon a formation of ice and snow that provided a modicum of shelter from the piercing winds. We set to work building an impromptu snow shelter, scooping and packing the snow to form a protective barrier against the wind. Once we'd made a space that was small but secure, we settled in. Our breath fogged up in the confined space, but it was better than being exposed to the elements. "We need a fire," Becca said, her teeth chattering as she spoke. I nodded, fumbling with the waterproof matches we had in our pack. The wood we'd managed to gather was scant and frozen, but soon a feeble fire was flickering between us, providing some warmth and, more importantly, a psychological comfort. From our shelter, we could see the faint orange glow of the burning village in the distance. It was a haunting sight, the ghostly illumination a grim reminder of what we'd left behind. We hardly said a word to each other, the weight of our recent encounter hanging in the air. I felt a need to say something, but wasn't ready to discuss the terrifying implications of what we'd faced. Instead, I asked, "Where'd you learn to shoot like that?" Becca stared into the fire, her gaze distant. "My dad used to take me and my brothers hunting when we were kids. We grew up in Newfoundland. Every season, without fail, we'd load the pickup and head up to the northern peninsula." "What did you hunt?" I asked. "Mostly small game, like snowshoe hares and grouse, but also the occasional moose," she said absent-mindedly. "Wow, sounds like a lot of fun," I said. "It was. It was the highlight of my childhood," Becca said, her voice devoid of joy. "Until my youngest brother Chris got lost." Her somber blue eyes were lit up by the fire. "I was the oldest. I was supposed to be watching him," Becca confessed, her voice barely above a whisper. But I got distracted for just a moment. "That's all it took." "Becca," I began. "We found him a day later, but it was too late. He had died of exposure." Becca's voice faltered slightly. The weight of her guilt filled the small space between us. "I'm so sorry," I started saying. She could see how uncomfortable the conversation was making both of us feel. "Hey, so anyway, that was a hell of a throwback there," Becca complimented me, changing the subject, her demeanor changing as well. I smiled faintly and shrugged. "I used to play baseball in high school." "Oh really?" she asked, her brows lifting above her frosty eyelashes. "You must have been the MVP." "I mostly just kept the bench warm," I confessed, feeling a pang of the old familiar embarrassment. "Well, it was their loss," Becca replied, her voice steady, sincere. The compliment warmed me more than the fire. I just gave her a nod. We were both too tired to talk, and it seemed like a positive note to end on. There was a silence between us, filled only by the soft crackling of the fire and the low growl of the storm outside. We were both lost in our own thoughts, our own memories. Tonight had unearthed ghosts we'd rather leave buried, but we weren't alone in the storm, in the middle of nowhere. We had each other, and for now that was enough. June 20th, 2021. The storm raged outside, the howling winds and snow pelting against our makeshift shelter, while my mind churned with questions, doubts, and fear. In the early hours of the morning, an unexpected sight met our eyes. As we huddled around the small fire, our bodies seeking warmth and comfort from each other's presence, a faint cawing sound echoed through the storm. Above us, the gray-white sky darkened, and a large flock of ravens appeared, circling our tiny shelter against the wrath of the storm. A harsh caw echoed through the air, cutting through the storm like a knife. Their flapping wings were barely audible over the storm, yet the birds maintained a steady formation, completely unaffected by the gale. Two of the ravens broke away from the group and landed a few feet away from us. As they turned to face us, I realized, to my horror, that they were eyeless. An empty, dark void existed where their eyes should have been, mirroring the soulless eyes of the Ijarak we encountered back at the village. One of the ravens started to speak in a voice that was hauntingly familiar, a little girl's voice. "Mama, where are you? It's so dark. I'm scared." It cawed, echoing innocence and fear. The other raven spoke next, the voice of a woman filled with a mother's worry. "I can't find my child, my Aputi," it cried out. Aputi, the name reverberated in my mind. The mother was Nanook, and the little girl was Aputi. I remembered them from my visit to the village days before. Aputi was a curious child, and Nanook had the warmest of smiles. The thought of their fate made my stomach churn. Looking up, we saw the other ravens had begun to circle lower. Each one uttered a single statement, each in a different voice, each a haunting echo of the villagers. The air was filled with their desperate cries, pleas for help, and calls for loved ones. Becca drew back in horror. "The voices. Those are the villagers, aren't they?" she gasped, putting a gloved hand to her mouth. I didn't respond. I just shook my head in disbelief. I couldn't think straight with the macabre cacophony of disembodied voices ringing in my ears. Becca turned to me and squeezed my arm tight. "What's happening? Are these ravens also Eerie? What did they do to the villagers?" she asked, her eyes boring into mine. "The Eerie are just made-up stories," I reiterated. "They're not real. I don't believe in superstitions either, but I'm seeing the impossible with my own eyes," she said, gesturing to the flock of ravens circling us. I swallowed hard, glancing at the ravens as they swooped lower. I didn't want to entertain the possibility, but in the face of the inexplicable, what else could I do? "All right," I began, my voice shaky. "Let's pretend the Eerie is real." I took a deep breath and composed my thoughts. In Inuit myths, people are turned into Eerie, which are like twisted caricatures of themselves, often as punishment for disrespecting the spirits of nature. This could be anything from failing to perform the proper ritual for a prey they killed to not properly honoring the dead. Or in our case, Becca stared at me, fear dawning in her eyes, drilling a mile into the side of a cursed mountain. I hesitated but nodded. "Yeah, I believe so. I think we might have unwittingly released some kind of entity or force. That gas, maybe it's not just gas, maybe it's something spiritual, something ancient. And exposure to it is turning everyone into Eerie." "So those ravens are the villagers?" asked Becca. "I think so," I responded. "And that creature back at the village?" she asked. "I think the drill crew were all amalgamated to form that thing," I explained. "That's why it couldn't maintain its shape, and had all their voices." "Oh my God," Becca exclaimed, her face becoming ashen with the realization. "Wait, are we going to turn too?" she asked, her voice filled with dread. "I don't know," I replied, unable to mask the fear in my own voice. I didn't want to imagine that fate for us. I wouldn't let that happen to us. But deep down, I knew the reality. We had been exposed to the gas too. If my hypothesis was correct, we were already infected. Suddenly, another raven descended from the circling flock and landed on our shelter, its eyeless gaze locked on us. It cawed in a voice we hadn't yet heard, one that struck terror in our hearts. "Your time will come," it croaked in a gravelly voice before taking off, disappearing into the storm. The words hung in the cold air, an ominous prophecy that made our surroundings feel even colder. June 21st, 2021. The realization that we were ticking time bombs weighed heavily over us. As the howling winds subsided, I felt compelled to break the eerie silence. I turned on the radio, and the static-filled airwaves filled our shelter. After a few adjustments, I managed to reach Outpost Aurora. "Outpost Aurora, this is Noah Kalik. Do you copy?" I called into the radio. After a moment of heart-pounding silence, Dr. Anderson's voice crackled to life. "Noah, we've been trying to reach you. Are you and Becca all right?" She sounded relieved to hear us. "Sonia, we're alive," I said, "but we're not exactly all right. We're holed up in a makeshift shelter after an encounter." The hesitation in my voice must have conveyed the gravity of our situation, for Dr. Anderson's tone became serious. "What kind of encounter?" she asked. I took a deep breath before delving into our harrowing ordeal with the Eerie. Dr. Anderson was silent for a long time, taking in the incredible tale. I don't know what to say, but we've had our own troubles here. The effects of the gas are becoming more pronounced. Symptoms are worsening. We're preparing for an immediate evacuation." Her words sent my heart racing. "What about the Inuit communities?" I asked, concern gripping me. We're attempting to contact as many as we can, she responded. Now listen carefully. I've already radioed for an emergency evacuation of the outpost. The helicopter is arriving tomorrow at 0600 hours. We're pulling out as soon as it arrives. I urged you two to get back to base as soon as you can. I glanced at Becca, who had been listening intently. She looked pale, but nodded, indicating her agreement. We'll head back to base as soon as the storm lets up, I assured her, then added, be careful. If our theory about the gas is correct, its effects are much more than just physical. There was a pause on the other end before Sonia replied, her voice filled with grim resolve. We'll keep that in mind. Stay safe, you two, and hurry back. The journey back to Outpost Aurora was a grueling test of our endurance and sanity. The sled dogs, once full of vigor and enthusiasm, had started to behave oddly. They howled at the barren wasteland and growled at unseen threats, their eyes vacant and terrified. The potent stench of the gas seemed to be getting to them. As much as it filled me with dread, we had to press on, for the alternative was unthinkable. Upon nearing the outpost, we were met with an unsettling silence, broken only by a plume of smoke ascending from the storage area. The site resembled a ghost town, devoid of its former liveliness. The once bustling scientific station was now unnaturally silent and desolate, nearly blending into the frozen, monochromatic landscape. Dread coiled in my stomach as we approached the source of the smoke. Our worst fears were confirmed. The snowmobiles and the snowcat that were once neatly parked in storage were now reduced to a destroyed and smoldering heap. Becca kept a firm grip on her rifle, her eyes darting around the surroundings. I could see her breath quicken, her gloved fingers turning white from the pressure she exerted on the weapon. I felt the cold handle of Katak's knife in my hand. I don't like this, she whispered. Yeah, I know what you mean, I muttered. Cautiously, we made our way into the main building, our flashlight beams cutting through the oppressive darkness. We were met with a sight that will forever be etched into my mind. We froze in our tracks as the light fell upon the gruesomely mutated bodies of our colleagues. Their bodies were grotesquely melded into half-human, half-animal monstrosities. Fur sprouted from their skin in patches, their limbs elongated and clawed like a polar bear, and some bore the spiraled tusks of a narwhal protruding grotesquely from their distorted faces. Their eye sockets were empty, a dark void where a spark of life should have been, echoing a now all too familiar cruel fate. Becca stifled a scream, her hand flying to her mouth to suppress the horrified gasp that threatened to escape. I felt a wave of nausea wash over me, while rising in my throat. The sight was monstrous, a scene straight out of the darkest of nightmares. Our hearts pounded as we sprinted through the dimly lit, eerily quiet corridors. Our destination was the radio room. If we could reach it, we could send a distress signal and hopefully get the help we needed. When we finally reached the room, our hopes crashed. The room was a wreck. Wires hung from the ceiling like entrails sparking erratically. The radio equipment was shattered, smashed to pieces. The air was filled with the acrid smell of burned electronics. Everything had been methodically and thoroughly destroyed. The room was filled with an unsettling, almost hypnotic murmur. It took a moment for our flashlights to find the source. Dr. Anderson was slumped over the radio console. Her skin was a mottled, bluish-gray, waterlogged and bloated, giving her the macabre appearance of a corpse fished from icy waters. Her clothes were sodden, clinging to her form, while strands of hair plastered to her face and her open eyes stared blankly, a chilling resemblance to a drowned victim's final gaze. Her throat moved rhythmically, producing an awful semblance of speech. The last words she ever said to us echoed throughout the room. Stay safe, you two, and hurry back. Her vacant eyes stared blankly at the radio console, her hands still clutching the receiver as if her final act was an attempt to call for help. It was a chilling sight. The site director was dead, yet her body kept broadcasting her final utterances, like a macabre puppet show. It was clear that there would be no contact with the outside world. Becca was the first to move. She approached Dr. Anderson slowly, a look of profound sadness on her face. She reached out and gently detached the receiver from Sonia's rigid grip. The distress call ceased abruptly, leaving us in an eerie silence that hung heavy in the air. She lured us here. No help is coming, Becca whispered, her voice shaking, the enormity of the situation crashing down on her. We can't stay here, I declared. Although neither of us wished to linger, we needed to gather supplies. We scavenged through the base, gathering what we could carry. The infirmary provided us with essential medical supplies. The mess hall offered canned goods, dehydrated meals, and water. In the equipment room we found survival gear, thermal blankets, flares, extra clothing, a compact camping stove, and an ice axe. As we cautiously navigated the labyrinthine corridors, I voiced the question gnawing at me. Why us? I asked, glancing at her. Why are we the only ones who haven't transformed? It doesn't make sense, I muttered, thinking out loud. We were exposed to the gas before most of them. Why haven't we turned? After a long silence, Becca broke the quiet with a theory. Maybe the gas affects those who have been at the base longer, she suggested, her voice barely a whisper. I looked at her, taken aback. What do you mean? Erica was the most senior member of the station. She's been there the longest, Becca explained. It would explain why she was the first to be affected. I nodded, slowly understanding. And since I'm the newest member, that would make me the last to be affected. Exactly, she affirmed. But there was a hesitation in her voice, a reluctance that I couldn't ignore. So Becca, I said, stopping to face her in the dwindling light. How long have you been at Aurora? I've been here for a couple months, she confessed under her breath. A couple months? I asked, surprised. Suddenly, everything fell into place. The details I had overlooked before, her low rank at the base, her social isolation. You're a rookie, aren't you? I finally said. I'm not a rookie, she protested weakly. I'm just not as experienced as the others. Her gaze flicked up to meet mine, an uncertain smile playing on her lips. I worked in the oil and gas industry straight out of college. It was good pay, but I hated what I was doing. I jumped at the chance when I saw they were looking for someone with drilling experience to work at a climate research station. She desperately tried to explain. I studied her face in the dim, cold light, her words echoing in the icy, harsh silence. I sighed, reached out, and placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. What does it matter? We're all each other's got, I said, and I don't think I could ask for a better partner in all of this. Becca gave me a weak but appreciative smile. Thanks, Noah, she said, her voice barely audible over the howling wind. I feel the same. We stood in the harsh chill for a moment, united in our struggle for survival. After gathering everything we needed, we left Outpost Aurora behind for good. The imposing structure, once a hub of scientific discovery, and now a place of horror and death, loomed in our rear view as we set off into the wilderness. Our destination was unclear, but we knew we had to keep moving, away from the memories that haunted us, and towards the slimmest chance of safety. June 22nd, 2021. The following day was the most challenging yet, testing our resolve and shattering the last bits of normalcy we held on to. The Huskies, our reliable companions and our sole means of transport through this icy hellscape, began to succumb to the poison that had invaded their bodies. They couldn't even stand anymore, let alone pull a sled. Their fur started to shed rapidly, revealing unnatural growths and deformities that seemed to writhe beneath their skin. Their pained whimpers and growls echoed throughout the snow-filled air, a reminder of the horror we faced. Their once sparkling eyes were now clouded over. The sight of them suffering was heart-wrenching. These creatures, who had once bounded through the snow with joyous abandon, were now crippled with pain and fear. Becca was visibly distraught. She spent most of the day tending to them, desperately trying to alleviate their suffering. But the more time she spent with them, the more she seemed to realize the grim truth. There was no coming back for them. I found her kneeling in the snow beside the dogs, her face pale and her eyes red from tears. Noah, she said, her voice breaking. I can't let them suffer. They deserve better than this. I knew what she was implying, but the thought of it filled me with dread. Becca, are you sure? Maybe there's still a way. She shook her head, cutting me off. You've seen what this thing does to living being. I won't let that happen to my dogs. Her determination was clear, but the pain in her eyes was heartbreaking. I offered to help, ready to share this unbearable burden with her, but she refused. She shook her head, a hollow look in her eyes. They're my dogs, Noah, she said. Her voice was strained, but resolute. I should be the one to do it. There was a finality in her voice that broke no argument. With a heavy heart, I nodded. I said my goodbyes, thanking each dog for their companionship and strength, for carrying us across the endless expanse of ice and snow. I gave Becca a supportive squeeze on the shoulder before I stepped away. I retreated to give her some privacy. As I walked away, the harsh wind bit into my skin. Then came the sounds that echoed across the frozen landscape. The gunshots, for in total. Each one was a piercing reminder of the cruel reality we were living in. After what felt like an eternity, Becca walked towards me, her face devoid of any emotion. Her eyes, however, betrayed the immense grief she was feeling. As she wiped away the last of her tears, I saw a hardness in her gaze that hadn't been there before. "Let's keep moving," she said, her voice hollow. We spent the early morning hours studying the weatherproof map. A compass indicated our direction, and also acted as a paperweight. The situation was grim. Assuming every village in the area had been devastated by the gas, the closest human settlement was the town of Utqiagvik, almost 100 miles away. Even in the best of conditions, the journey would be arduous. On foot in our current predicament seemed utterly impossible. The truth was unavoidable. We were isolated, alone in the vast frozen wilderness, our only lifelines erased by an unseen force we were only beginning to comprehend. A profound silence settled over us as we stared at the map, the enormity of our predicament sinking in. As we sat in silence, I noticed Becca tracing a route with her finger, her brows furrowed in concentration. I looked at her, a glimmer of hope igniting within me. "Becca?" She turned to me, a determined look on her face. "I used to work on an oil rig not too far from here," she said. She pointed out a spot on the map, a little dot off the northern coast of Alaska. "It's about a 30-mile journey northeast of here," she explained. "We'd have to kayak there. We can hug the coast. It'll take 2, maybe 3 days. If we're lucky, we'll run into one of the rig's crew boats." Her proposal was a risky one. Kayaking through Arctic waters was a dangerous proposition. We would have to navigate the freezing, unpredictable ocean. "I don't know about this. Who knows how the gas has affected sea life? Hell, a rogue wave could plunge us into the icy waters." I expressed my doubts. "We don't have many choices," Becca replied, her voice firm. "We can either try for Utqiagvik and likely die of exposure and exhaustion before we reach it, or we take a chance on the rig. I know the second option is risky, but at least there's a chance." I looked back at the map, my eyes fixated on the tiny dot representing the rig. The weight of our decision hung heavily in the air. Finally I met Becca's eyes, finding a look of frightened determination. I nodded. The rig is then, June 23, 2021. Our 2-person inflatable kayak felt like a tiny speck on the vast, endless sea, dwarfed by the towering icebergs and the shadowy mutated leviathans that lurked beneath the water's surface. A chilling wind whistled through the desolate landscape, the only sound other than the rhythmic splash of our paddles against the cold water. In those hours, the line between night and day blurred, the sun never dipping far enough to plunge us into darkness. Time became measured in strokes of the paddle and the rhythmic rise and fall of the ocean. We made slow progress, taking turns paddling and resting, stealing moments of sleep when we could. We nibbled at our rations, preserving what we could for the uncertain journey ahead. On the second day, a light drizzle soaked us to the bone, the biting cold gnawing at our fingers and faces. As we huddled around the map to determine our bearings, I noticed Becca shivering beside me. Her face was pale, her lips tinted blue, and her speech was slightly slurred. "Becca, are you all right?" I asked, my voice barely audible above the howling wind. "I'm fine," she insisted, but her chattering teeth betrayed her. It was clear I need to get her out of the cold and fast. Searching the shoreline, I spotted a dark recess in the cliffside. "We're going ashore," I declared, veering our kayak towards the land. Becca didn't argue, her strength sapped by the relentless cold. We managed to pull our kayaks onto the rocky shore, the land a welcome reprieve from the icy waters. The cave we found provided some shelter from the wind, its mouth wide enough to prevent the buildup of snow. Once inside, I turned my attention to Becca. I removed her soaking wet outer layer and wrapped her in a thermal blanket. I pulled out our compact camping stove from the supplies, grateful that we had it. A fire would have been ideal, but in these conditions, it was next to impossible to start one. The small portable heater emitted a soft glow as I ignited it, its heat radiating into the cold cave. Next, I removed her gloves and snow boots, inspecting her extremities. My heart sank at the sight of her fingers and toes, white, hard, and numb, with a waxy appearance, all signs of frostbite. Using the first aid kit we scavenged from the outpost, I carefully cleaned and bandaged her frostbitten digits. Trying to reassure her, I said, "It's not too severe. You'll recover." We huddled together under the thermal blanket to conserve heat. Becca slipped in and out of consciousness, her body fighting the hypothermia. In her delirious state, Becca turned to me, her blue eyes clouded with confusion and fear. "Noah," she murmured, her voice barely a whisper. Can you sing for me?" "Sing?" I was taken aback. The last thing I'd been expecting was a request for a song, but maybe in her confused state, she was seeking some comfort. She nodded, her gaze unfocused. "Something in Inuit," she requested. I thought about what to sing to her. I remembered as a child, I'd stubbornly resist sleep until my mother returned from work, gripped by an irrational fear that she wouldn't be there when I awoke. To calm me, Grandma Inuri would sing an ancient Inuit lullaby, a song about the undying love between the moon and the sea, about their eternal dance and infinite patience. Clearing my throat, I started singing. My voice echoed softly in the cave. The lullaby, which I hadn't sung in years, flowed out in a gentle rhythm. Eladi can get sack, tack kick, UK your pack. The moon shines brightly, the moon watches over. My voice grew stronger with each note, the lullaby's story of strength, love, and resilience reflecting our circumstances. Becca's eyes fluttered closed, her face relaxing slightly as the song washed over her. I watched her as I sang, the portable heater casting a soft glow on her pale face. The lullaby seemed to bring her some peace, her shaking lessening a bit as she leaned into me, her head resting on my shoulder. Her breathing started to sync with the rhythm of the song, slow and steady. It was a long, nerve-wracking night. I tried to stay awake, keeping a watchful eye on her and praying for the best. I woke to the dull gray of early morning, my body stiff from the cold and the warmth beside me missing. I shot upright, looking around the small space of the cave. "Becca," I called out, my voice bouncing off the stone walls. No response. The cave was empty, save for the remnants of our meager supplies. My heart pounded in my chest as my gaze landed on the thermal blanket discarded on the hard cave floor. I stumbled to my feet, grabbed the flashlight, and scanned the cavern. There was no sign of her. Rushing outside, I found a set of bare footprints in the snow. Each impression was stained with a speck of crimson blood. Becca's clothes were scattered along the path, torn and soaked with fresh snow. I followed the footprints, my stomach churning as I collected her discarded garments. The trail led me away from the cave, winding along the icy shoreline. The morning light cast a pale glow on the icy landscape, but there was no sign of Becca. My breath misted in the cold air as I followed her trail, the only indication that life still existed in this barren, frozen expanse. A sense of urgency pushed me to move faster, though the biting cold protested against every step. I knew exactly what this meant. This was paradoxical undressing, a known phenomenon of late-stage hypothermia. The person, in their confused and disoriented state, feels an intense sensation of heat and starts to undress, often leading to their demise in the freezing temperatures. The bloodstains in the snow grew fainter and then disappeared entirely, but the footprints continued, their direction unwavering. My mind was in a whirl, but I didn't have time to dwell on it. I knew what I had to do. With a determined stride, I started to follow the footprints, praying that I wasn't too late. After what felt like hours, I saw her in the distance, a fragile silhouette against the white expanse. Her bare skin was almost the same color as the snow, tinged blue in the morning chill. Her auburn hair, once neatly braided, was now a wild mess of strands whipping in the biting wind. "Becca!" I shouted, my voice a desperate echo against the icy desolation. She didn't turn around. She staggered, barely upright, as she continued her aimless journey through the snow. As I approached, the wind carried fragments of a haunting melody to my ears. Becca was muttering, almost singing, in fluent Inuit, a language that just days earlier she barely knew 2 words of. "Ijarak, you come in the night, filling our homes with terror and fright. Your cold, empty eyes peering deep within, your wickedness lurking in the darkness, and we can do nothing but watch." Summoning every ounce of courage, I stepped forward and gently turned her around to face me. The sight that met my eyes was worse than any nightmare I could have ever imagined. Becca, once the epitome of strength and vitality, stood in front of me resembling a frostbitten corpse. Her once vibrant blue eyes were replaced with empty sockets from which emerged squirming tendrils that undulated in the cold morning air. Her face was a canvas of jagged lines and fractures resembling the intricate tattoos we had discovered on the ancient mummies at the drill site. In her hand, she held a scalpel from the medkit, its metallic surface gleaming ominously under the weak sunlight. She raised her hand, the scalpel glinting menacingly. She stared at her other hand with an unnerving fascination. I watched in horror as she positioned the scalpel over one of her fingers. "Becca, no!" I cried out, but my plea was drowned by the howling wind. Suddenly, she brought the scalpel down to her hand, severing one of her frostbitten fingers with a chilling efficiency. The sound of flesh being cut open echoed ominously in the frigid silence, a horrid squelching noise that was both wet and grating, reminiscent of a butcher carving a slab of meat. There was no cry of pain, no reaction to the gruesome act she was performing on herself. As the severed digit fell to the snowy ground, an overpowering stench hit me, an unholy blend of decay and brine that reminded me of rotting fish left out in the sun. She continued the gruesome task with a grim determination, each slice of the scalpel followed by the horrible thud of a finger falling onto the snow, and then the horror compounded. The amputated fingers started to wriggle on the icy ground, transforming into tentacled monstrosities that writhed as if taunting me with their grotesque existence. I racked my brain to make sense of what I was witnessing. The old tales of Sedna, the Inuit sea goddess, echoed in my mind. Cast into the sea by her father, her fingers were cut off as she tried to cling to his kayak. As each finger hit the water, they transformed into sea creatures. This was like some twisted parody of the legend. Becca cocked her head towards me, the tendrils in her eyes pulsating with a strange, unnatural rhythm. A haunting smirk played on her lips, a perverse mockery of the confident smile I had grown accustomed to seeing. She raised her mutilated hand to me, her thumb and forefinger forming a sinister beckoning gesture. Her voice, when she spoke, was a haunting echo of the woman I had known. Join us. June 24th, 2021, she continued her grisly transformation, tendrils waving like wicked antennas, the air around us growing colder and more oppressive. Becca, it's me, Noah, I pleaded, trying to pierce through her madness. You have to fight whatever this is. You're stronger than this. She paused for a moment, her severed fingers ceasing their squirming dance in the snow, and I saw a flicker of recognition in the writhing mass of her eyes. But it was short-lived. Without warning, she lunged at me, her free hand still clutching the scalpel slashed at me in a frenzied attack. I stumbled backward, but she was on me in an instant, scratching and biting with a ferocity that was nothing short of animalistic. Her detached fingers, now unnervingly animated, slithered towards me, twining around my legs, tugging and pulling, forcing me onto the icy snow. I gasped as one looped around my neck, its cold touch stinging like a frigid brand. She opened her mouth, revealing even more tendrils, each one hissing as they stretched towards me. Suddenly, the sharp pain of her scalpel penetrated my side, the icy cold blade cutting through my flesh. Bleed with me, she whispered sadistically, as she twisted the scalpel, causing excruciating pain to erupt from my wound. I could feel the warmth of my blood staining the ice beneath me. She leaned in close. Her voice was a chilling whisper that froze my blood. They're coming, Noah, she said. Can't you hear them? They've been calling to me, singing to me. It's a beautiful song, a song of rebirth, of transformation. Her severed fingers tightened around my throat, cutting off my air supply. My vision blurred and darkened. In sheer desperation, I groped for anything I could use to defend myself. My fingers curled around the cold handle of my ice axe. With a swift, desperate swing, I struck her at the base of her neck. She gasped, her grip around my neck loosening. I rolled her off me, scrambling to put distance between us. But she quickly recovered, pulling the axe out of her neck with an unholy strength. A dark, pungent liquid oozed from the gaping wound, staining the snow with its sickly hue. Becca, please don't do this, I pleaded with her. She brandished the axe, a primal scream erupting from her lips as she charged at me. My hand went to my side, gripping the handle of Katak's meteorite knife. As she ran towards me, I instinctively braced myself, aiming the blade at her. With a terrifying shriek, she impaled herself on the knife, her momentum carrying her forward until she slumped against me. With an agonized whimper, she staggered backwards, the fierceness in her eyes dimming. Her tentacled fingers stilled, the squirming tendrils retracting into the emptiness of her eye sockets. She looked up at me with a terrifying mixture of fear and confusion. As Becca fell backward onto the snowy ground, her appearance shifted, morphing into an achingly familiar form. My heart pounded in my chest as I looked down into the face of my grandmother, Inuri. The icy landscape around me faded, replaced by the aged walls of our childhood apartment. I glanced at my hands, covered in blood, but they weren't mine. They were large, scarred, aged from years of labor, my father's hands. The ceremonial knife in my grip transformed into a crude switchblade, its edge ominously glinting in the dim light, fresh blood dripping from it. In the corner of the room, a small figure huddled on the windowsill, wide eyes filled with terror. It was me, younger, smaller, bearing witness to a horror no child should see. The night my father, driven by a drunken rage, took the life of the one person who meant everything to me. No, I cried, rushing to the figure on the floor. Dropping to my knees, I cradled my grandma in my arms, my tears freezing to my face. She looked just like the night she died. In an instant, my surroundings shifted. No longer was I in the warmth of my home, but back in the Arctic wilderness. It was no longer my grandmother I held in my arms, but Becca. Her skin, once flush with life, was now as pale and cold as the ice that hemmed us in. The once monstrous tendrils retracted from her eye sockets, revealing the blue irises I knew so well. A strangled gasp escaped her lips as the harsh wind whipped around us. I could feel her body shuddering with each ragged breath she took, a frail echo of her former vitality. My gaze fell on her chest, where a dark stain was slowly spreading. Using Kadak's knife, I ripped off a piece of my jacket and pressed it against the wound, attempting to stem the bleeding, but it felt like trying to dam a river with twigs. "Noah," she croaked, her voice barely audible over the wind. "Becca," I said, reaching for her hand. It was icy cold. "I'm here. Stay with me," I said, cupping her face in my hands. I could see fear and confusion in her eyes, but also recognition. She reached up, her hand weakly clutching mine. "I'm so cold," she croaked out, a faint hint of her old self returning. I wrapped my arms around her, pulling her close to me. My heart pounded painfully against my ribcage as I held her against my chest. Her breaths came in short, uneven gasps, each one slower than the last. "It's going to be okay," I lied, trying to infuse my voice with as much confidence and warmth as I could muster. I knew her condition was dire, the life seeping from her as surely as the blood staining the snow beneath us, but I couldn't let her last moments be filled with fear and despair. "Noah," she struggled to say. For a moment, I saw a spark of the old Becca in her eyes, the fierce determination that had always defined her. But then, her eyes rolled back in her head and her body went limp in my arms. "Becca," I whispered, "stay with me." Her only response was a soft, gurgling sound, as if she was trying to speak, but couldn't. Her body grew colder, her skin turning a sickly blue. "No," I muttered, shaking her. "Becca, wake up." But it was too late. With a final, shuddering breath, she went still. The hand I was holding fell limply to her side, the icy chill of death already creeping into her skin. I wasn't sure how long I stayed there, holding Becca's lifeless body, before I finally managed to stand up. With the last shreds of my strength, I made a decision. Becca deserved a proper farewell, not to be left on this cold, desolate landscape as carrion. In a daze, I began to gather rocks from the surrounding area, hauling them over to the spot where Becca's body lay. In the harsh Arctic wilderness, you couldn't dig a grave in the permafrost. There were no flowers to leave on her grave, no trees to make a coffin, just cold, indifferent stones. Once I had enough rocks, I set to work constructing an inukshuk, a cairn used by the Inuit as a marker to help the recently deceased to find their way to the afterlife. Each stone was a silent tribute to the woman who had been my companion, my confidant, my friend. Each stone was carefully selected and placed, forming a silhouette that mirrored the human form. The tallest stone for the body, a pair of stones for the arms, and a smaller stone for the head. The work was hard, and the freezing wind didn't make it any easier, but I forced myself to continue, focusing on the task at hand as a way to escape the grim reality of what had transpired. Next, I laid Becca's body beneath the inukshuk, folding her arms over her chest. With a heavy heart, I said my final goodbyes, whispering them into the icy wind, praying that they would reach her wherever she was. Your spirit lives on in my memories, never forgotten, never incomplete. Lastly, I placed Kadak's otherworldly knife in her hands. I didn't know why, but I thought she would have more use for it than I would. With the last of my energy drained, I stepped back to take in the sight. The inukshuk stood tall against the pale sky, its form contrasted against the snow-covered landscape. It was a ghostly figure standing vigil over Becca's final rites, a silent sentry keeping watch over her as she journeyed to the spirit world. I must have wandered for what felt like hours, perhaps even days, with no sense of time or direction. The icy landscape stretched out indefinitely, a vast expanse of desolation, as if the entire world had succumbed to the frost. I was numb, both physically from the piercing cold that infiltrated my clothes and skin, and mentally from the shock of what had occurred. Every gust of wind, every crunch of snow beneath my feet seemed to echo Becca's presence. Each shadow cast by the moonlight transformed into demons coming to claim me. My side throbbed with a persistent pain where Becca had stabbed me, a cruel reminder of the nightmare that had become my reality. The wound was probably infected by now, or maybe I was succumbing to hypothermia. I didn't really care. Each gasping breath felt like an accomplishment, each blink a momentous effort. My mind, once sharp and alert, now wandered aimlessly in a fugue state. Suddenly, a shadow flickered across the white canvas of the snow. The shadow caused a shiver of dread to seize my body. I squinted, shielding my eyes against the weak sun, and made out the silhouette of a helicopter. Its rotors were a mere whisper in the icy air, the dull throb of its engines barely audible over the wind's moan. In my haze of fear and exhaustion, the helicopter was another menacing figure, another Ijarak sent to torment me. I couldn't risk it. I couldn't bear the thought of falling prey to those shape-shifting demons again. With trembling fingers, I fumbled in my pocket, my numb fingers finding the reassuring grip of the flare gun. With a shaky hand, I fired the flare. The sudden light, brilliant against the gray sky, arched upwards, a fiery serpent against the dull expanse. The sharp smell of gunpowder filled my nostrils, momentarily overpowering the stench of decay that still clung to my clothes. It was a desperate attempt to ward off my tormentor, a signal flare that carried more of a plea for mercy than a call for help. The helicopter veered towards the flare, like a moth drawn to a flame. The last thing I remember was the sudden brightness, an intense spotlight blinding me. A rush of noise, the helicopter descending, shouting voices, the crunch of boots on snow. And then, with a nauseating lurch, the world turned black. August 1st, 2021, when I regained consciousness, the frosty landscape was replaced with white sterile walls and a rhythmic beeping. I was in a hospital, the incessant beeping originating from the machines monitoring my vitals. My frozen clothes were gone, replaced with a thin hospital gown, and the once throbbing wound now bore a clean dressing. The first few days in the hospital passed in a haze as I drifted in and out of consciousness. There was always someone there when I woke up, a nurse, a doctor, an official from the Environmental Protection Agency. Their faces drifting in and out of focus as I wrestled with my own tortured thoughts. As the days passed, my strength began to return. I began to sit up, to speak, to ask questions. With each question, I was met with a flood of information, each revelation more horrifying than the last. They told me about the drill, about the toxic hydrogen sulfide released into the air. They spoke of a devastating wave of poison that had decimated both the research station and the nearby settlements. The scientists explained the symptoms, how exposure to hydrogen sulfide could result in severe neurological damage. They talked of disorientation and paranoia, of vivid hallucinations that seemed so real, they had driven some to madness, to violence, even to murder. They described how the villagers had wandered off into the snowstorm, disoriented and confused, driven by hallucinations to their doom. Only a single newborn infant, miraculously untouched by the poison, had been found alive amidst the ashes of Silip Inua. The personnel at Outpost Aurora had fared even worse. They destroyed their only means of escape, dooming themselves in their madness. Some had succumbed to the toxic gas, while others had fallen victim to their own colleagues, driven by their poisoned minds to horrific acts of violence. The doctors explained that the things I'd witnessed, the terrifying encounters with the Ijarak, talking ravens, the monstrous transformation of Becca, were all products of my poisoned mind. They weren't real. They couldn't have been real. I wanted to believe them. I really did. It was easier to accept that I'd simply been hallucinating than to confront the horror of what I thought I had witnessed. The people at the research station, the villagers, they were all victims of a terrible accident, not some supernatural force. It was tragic, but it was rational. It was something I could understand. But there were things I just couldn't shake, things that didn't fit neatly into their hydrogen sulfide theory. The village, for instance. Yes, they'd found the burned-out remains of the settlement, but not a single trace of the villagers themselves. Search parties had painstakingly combed the surrounding area for days, enduring the harsh elements, all in vain. Not a single body was recovered. 30 people just don't disappear without a trace, not even in a harsh, frozen landscape like this one. Where were the bodies? Why weren't there any signs of a struggle or of the panicked flight they described? And then there was Becca. The recovery team found the Inuksuk I'd constructed for her, but when they'd opened it, expecting to recover her body, they found it empty. There were bare human footprints leading from the cairn to the sea, footprints that, according to the weather records, were made days after the gas cloud had dissipated. How was it possible? How could a dead woman, encased in a tomb of ice and stone, simply walk away? July 7th, 2023, in the aftermath of the horrifying events at Outpost Aurora, the authorities declared the entire area a disaster zone. The high levels of residual toxins, along with the lingering risk of additional leaks from the deserted drilling site, rendered the area too hazardous for habitation. The remoteness of the disaster allowed the subsequent relocation of the surviving Inuit tribes to be done clandestinely. During this period, I was consumed by a profound sense of guilt and duty to assist my people. As an Inuit, and as one of the few survivors of the incident, I felt a deep connection and responsibility to those who had also lost so much. I worked tirelessly to help facilitate the relocations, ensuring that my people were moved safely, with dignity, and with as little disruption to their way of life as possible. I provided guidance on cultural norms, tradition, and practices, ensuring they were preserved and respected in the relocation process. During this period, I also found the strength to return to my academic pursuits. I completed my PhD in anthropology, my dissertation focusing on the resilience of Inuit societies in the face of severe climatic and socio-cultural disruptions. After the completion of my doctorate, I realized I no longer had the stomach for field research. The trauma of what had unfolded had left deep imprints on my psyche, making the once thrilling prospect of Arctic exploration a haunting reminder of the fragility of life. Instead, I moved back to Anchorage to accept a university lecturer position and have tried to live as normal a life as possible. Yet even as I carve out this new path, my past remains with me, especially in the wintertime, when snow falls like a blanket over the city, obscuring everything in a shroud of white. On these nights, I often find myself drawn to the coast. I walk along the shoreline, gazing out over the frost-kissed waters, half expecting to see a figure emerging from the icy depths, Becca, or rather, the thing she became. Her memory lingers, a ghost in the snow, a specter in the sea foam. Most nights, I sleep like a literal baby. I knock out after I am full, and I wake up when I am hungry. It's like my internal clock. Last night, however, I was studying for my final exam, and I started feeling sleepy as it was getting really late, but I just wanted to get a few more practice questions in before I knocked out since my eyes were already sore from the lack of sleep. I finished up the last of the practice questions and got onto my bed ready for my power nap of 4 hours before I had to wake up and face my biggest nightmare. I stretch out my limbs and make my way towards my bed, getting so ready to crash. I get under the covers and cover every single part of my body except for my face, since I like to be swaddled when I sleep. 5 minutes? 10 minutes? 20 minutes? 45 minutes? I was not falling asleep no matter what. I wasn't hungry. I wasn't feeling uncomfortable, but I was tired as hell. I sat up frustrated and feeling flustered from how hard I was trying to fall asleep. I looked around my studio apartment, and a sudden urge of needing some fresh air had me putting on a hoodie and sweatpants. It's literally the middle of the summer, but I was trying to make myself look buff and like a man. I hide my hair in a bun and put the hood over my head. Just to preface this, I never take walks in the nighttime. Never. I live in New York City, and it's not even safe to walk around in the morning, not to mention at night. I was thinking of just standing near my building and taking a quick breather. I wasn't planning on wandering too far. I grab everything I need and I head outside, but my surroundings genuinely shocked me. The street lamps lit the streets in every corner. There were close to no blind spots. I live in Queens, a more rural area, so you would have to walk a good few streets from the resident block into an area where there are stores and restaurants. I look around and look at my phone. The time read 3:36 a.m. There was not a single person walking the streets. However, there were still a few cars driving up and down the streets once in a while. I walked to the end of my building and suddenly remembered there was a Chinese barbecue restaurant that was open until 5 a.m. in the morning and reopens at 10 p.m. that same day. The idea of grilled chicken and beef skewers has me waddling towards the direction of the restaurant. The walk was fairly quiet, and I slowly approached one of the bigger intersections where the buses ran, and oddly I saw a person. It was an old lady sitting on the bench at the bus stop, and instantly I felt a pang of sadness hit my chest. My nose tingles, and the urge to cry rises above all my other emotions. It was so sad to see an old lady out at this time. It was so late, and she was all by herself. She was probably lost. I walked towards the bus stop, and I didn't want to scare her, but I also wanted to make sure she was okay. So I stood a good 10 feet behind her, and checked the app for when the bus would arrive. The app said that the next bus was going to be in 10 minutes since buses run by the hour late at night. Sure enough, at around the 10-minute mark the bus came, and I heaved a sigh of relief, happy that the lady was going to get help finally. I start backing away slowly as I see the bus get close to the bus stop and slightly slow down. I looked at the bus, and the bus driver took a quick glance at the bus stop before he sped off. I stood there shocked and in disbelief that the bus driver would leave an elderly lady stranded in the middle of the night. I looked down at my phone to check when the next bus was going to arrive, and it was going to be 49 minutes before the next bus was coming through. I was racking my brain on what I can do to help. Do I call the police and report a lost elderly, or do I maybe ask her where she lives and call her an Uber? Finally deciding that maybe I should ask for her opinion first before I make a decision. I looked up and she was gone. I couldn't have been looking at my phone for more than a few minutes. I jog up to the bus stop and look at all the connecting streets to see if I can catch a glimpse of which direction she went in so I can catch up to her. I didn't see anyone. Maybe she's a fast walker because 2 to 3 minutes would be enough for me to walk a block. Not knowing really what to do, I continue on what I came out to do. I continued walking down, and 2 to 3 streets later the bustling street came into view, and it no longer felt like 4 a.m. in the morning. There were multiple parties of people walking up and down the streets. I walked into the restaurant to smell of barbecue filling every pore of my body. I was in food heaven. I ordered a chicken and beef skewer combo, which was 5 chicken and 5 beef grilled skewers. My food was ready in 5 to 10 minutes, and I opted to take it to go because I needed to get home and sleep. I lost a whole hour of sleep since I made the decision to come out and buy food. I ate my skewers happily as I made my way back home, once again pulling myself out of the bustling streets and into the quiet neighborhood. I was humming softly to myself and listening to the sound of my shoes hitting the ground. Not just my footsteps, I hear footsteps behind me as well. It felt like it was trying to mask my footsteps, but always a few milliseconds slower. I turned around suddenly nervous. Anxiety shot up from the pit of my stomach. My appetite dissipated within seconds, and I saw the lady who was sitting at the bus stop maybe 20 feet behind me. She also stopped walking, and she was staring blankly at me, feeling slightly better since she was an older lady, and I was a healthy female college student. I stared back at her wondering if she was going to approach me for help. The silence dragged on, and I started getting a little skeptical of why we were just staring at each other. The slight relief I felt earlier was replaced by a weird feeling in the pit of my stomach. Before I could figure out what to do next, I felt my feet turn around and walk towards my house. It was like my body was telling me to get the hell out of there. Now I was focusing 100 times more on the sound and footsteps around me. Sure enough, I heard a set of footsteps mirroring mine, and it actually sounded closer than before. The hair on the back of my neck stood up, and a chill ran down my back. I felt panic surge through my veins, and without a second word I sprinted down the streets. I observed my surroundings and saw the bus stop where I first spotted the lady. From the bus stop, my building was still about 5 streets away. I continued down one more street before I realized all I heard was the sound of my own footsteps and my heart pumping in my ears. I slowly slowed down and took a quick glance behind me, and I didn't see the lady. I came to a full stop and turned around looking for the lady. I looked further down and she was 2 streets away from me, exactly where I left her. Confused by this, I started walking backwards down the street towards my building and keeping my eyes strained on her. She stood still for maybe about a minute before she started walking towards me. She was walking at an alarmingly slow pace, almost as if she's saying, "Run all you want, I will eventually catch up." My hands ran cold from me and shook from the fear that gripped my body. Deciding not to waste another second out on the streets, I turned around and ran full speed towards the direction of my building, and when I was 1 street away from my building, I started to slow down and started jogging instead of sprinting. I took a quick glance behind me as I continued to jog towards my building, and what I saw made me stop to take a closer look. The lady was on the ground on all 4s crawling towards me, and she wasn't crawling slowly like a baby. She was crawling so fast. The 3-street distance I kept between us instantly became 2, and she was closing the distance between us so fast I could see her facial features growing clearer and clearer. She was wearing a smile that was inhumanely wide. If a regular person tried to smile like that, it would definitely hurt. A surge of chills ran down my back. I felt like I was frozen in place as she was crawling towards. A screech surged through the air, followed by a series of laughter that I can only describe as terrifying. She was now only a street away, and I felt tingles run down my legs before I forced myself to run. I needed to run away. No longer caring about the food I was still holding, I dropped it on the ground and started running for my life. Fear gripping every cell in my body. My knees threatening to give out, but I knew I needed to keep running. My building was right in front of me now, and not knowing how far back that creature was. A scream ripped out of my throat, so loud I scared myself. I wanted others to wake up and come down and help me. I needed to catch the attention of other people. My studio apartment was on the 3rd floor, and I was screaming my head off as I raced up the stairs, not knowing if the sound of the following footsteps was simply the sound of my footsteps bouncing off the walls, or from the creature that was crawling on all fours. But I was not about to find out. Adrenaline coursed through my body as I pulled the key out of my pocket and shoved it into the keyhole. In one swift motion, I turned the knob, opened the door, and threw myself into the room, bringing the door with me and slamming it shut. My door automatically locks upon closing, but I had an extra security notch, and I pulled the metal chain into the notch before I collapsed on the ground, exhausted from the running. I closed my eyes, trying to calm down my heartbeat, as I felt like I was going to jump out of my chest. A sudden ear-piercing sound froze me from all thoughts and action. I whipped my head around, and I saw a face pressed against my window with the same wide smile, but this time I could see her eyes. It was as wide as golf balls, and there was something different about it. There were no pupils. I sat on the ground in shock as I watched her run her long nails across the window, making a noise so high-pitched I had to cover my ears. It was like the sound of forcing a piece of chalk against the blackboard. I jump up and run towards the door. I unleash the chain and run across from me, banging on the door. The middle-aged couple opened with concern on their face, told them that there was some weird creature on my window, which obviously does sound kind of dumb. They hesitantly make their way to my studio apartment and look around, and there was nothing there. It was dead silent, like everything that I saw was all in my head. I ran towards the window and looked around, and like they said, there was nothing out there. The couple patted my back and told me to stop watching so many horror movies, and helped me close my door as they returned to their own homes. Just to be sure, I made sure my window was locked and closed my blinds before I collapsed on the ground once again. Not sure how long I laid on the floor, because when I opened my eyes again, it was due to my alarm ringing. I know I am not dreaming, because I am still in my hoodie, and my shoes are still on, and I have an exam today. I don't know what that thing was, or what it wanted from me. I just know that I am never ever going out at night ever again. My dog Bailey went missing a few days ago. I'd been out all day with my friend, bearing in mind I'm usually home the majority of the time due to being unable to work, so the dog is never alone, and usually if he is, it's not for too long. I also live with my parents and brother, so a lot of the time there's at least one person in the house. Monday I had gotten home later than usual. My parents hadn't got home from work yet, and my brother had left to stay at his girlfriend's a little after I'd left. As usual, I'd walked into the house shouting to Bailey that I was home. I walked into the kitchen to unlock his crate, and let him out when my heart sank. The crate door was wide open. I didn't panic straight away. I thought maybe my brother had forgotten to put him in his crate, although deep down I knew that the cameras and alarm would have picked up any movement. It had been about 10 minutes after I got home when I realized that the back door was still open. I immediately rushed outside, looking around the garden to see if Bailey was out there, but within seconds I realized a part of the fence was broken, and he must have somehow squeezed through it. I ended up calling my parents, and then my brother, who was adamant that he'd locked the back door and put the dog in his crate, although it wouldn't have been the first time he had forgotten to do so. I then ended up checking the cameras that in my panic I completely forgot about. This, however, freaked me out a bit. On the camera you could clearly see my brother putting Bailey in his crate, locking it, and then checking that all the doors and windows were closed. My heart sank. I felt violently ill. The only other way he could have got out would have been if someone broke in. The thought brought up so many questions. How did they unlock the door? How was there nothing broken? Why didn't the camera movement notification go off? I forwarded the cameras to see if I could find who let him out and open the door. Maybe my brother came back again? I got to one part in the recording and realized the dog was no longer in his crate. The door was wide open as I had found it. I went back a bit, but the recording didn't seem to have picked up any movement between the time he was in his crate to when he was gone. Nothing had shown up on any of the other cameras either. At this point, everyone was absolutely heartbroken. We didn't think any more of the weird situation and started asking around if anyone had seen him. We put up posters, posted things on social media. We were so determined to find him. I started getting nightmares after the first night he was gone. I'd often wake up in a cold sweat multiple times in the night. I couldn't stomach the awful images and thoughts surfacing in my head about what could have happened to him. I have been so attached to this dog the moment we got him to ever think that he wasn't going to come back. The thought was just unbearable. So when we found him today, Thursday morning, I felt like I could actually breathe again. We were all so relieved to have him back. That was until now. Bailey had been off ever since we found him, but originally it was just brushed off because he'd never been away from us that long, and we thought it had obviously shaken him up a bit. My parents still keep saying that, but his eyes, they're not his eyes. They're not those cute, innocent little puppy dog eyes. They're dark and cold and empty. And I know you could just say that it was from being alone outside for days, but there's just something wrong and I know it. No one believes me, but that is not our dog. Bailey was playful and would cuddle up next to you, and you'd feel so happy and loved. But this thing acts and pretends to be Bailey, but I swear it's not. The way it stares at me like I'm some sort of prey. When it cuddles up next to me, all I feel is cold. My anxiety feels at an all-time high like the dog, the thing, right next to me is dangerous. It looks at me like it knows. It knows I know. I've ended up staying at my friend's house for a few days. I just don't feel safe at home. I've been looking back on the cameras over and over, and I swear I can see some kind of shadow. My friend said my brain is making it up because I want to see something for some kind of explanation. Maybe she's right, but I don't know. I swear to you in the back of the garden, the same hour Bailey went missing, there's a face in the bushes, and it's not a human one. The figure is so hard to see, but it looks lanky and on all fours, and it's staring right at the camera. That figure is the same silhouette I can see on the kitchen floor on the camera after Bailey miraculously disappears. It's completely unnerving. I want to stop looking, but I can't seem to pull my face away from the screen. I don't know what's going on. I just know that that dog at home, if it even is one, is not Bailey, and I have a sinking feeling it'll do anything to make sure no one else finds out that it's not.